Part 3, Chapter 1 of The Gadfly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daria. The Gadfly by Ethel Lilian VOYNICH. Part 3, Chapter 1. The next 5 weeks were spent by Gemma and the Gadfly in a whirl of excitement and overwork, which left them little time or energy for thinking about their personal affairs. When the arms had been safely smuggled into papal territory, there remained a still more difficult and dangerous task, that of conveying them unobserved from the secret stores in the mountain caverns and ravines to the various local centres and thence to the separate villages. The whole district was swarming with spies, and Domenichino, to whom the Gadfly had entrusted the ammunition, sent into Florence a messenger with an urgent appeal for either help or extra time. The Gadfly had insisted that the work should be finished by the middle of June, and what with the difficulty of conveying heavy transports over bad roads and the endless hindrances and delays caused by the necessity of continually evading observation, Domenichino was growing desperate. "I am between Scylla and Charybdis," he wrote. "I dare not work quickly for fear of detection, and I must not work slowly if we are to be ready in time. Either send me efficient help at once, or let the Venetians know that we shall not be ready till the first week in July." The Gadfly carried the letter to Gemma, and while she read it, sat frowning at the floor and stroking the cat's fur the wrong way. "This is bad," she said. "We can hardly keep the Venetians waiting for 3 weeks." "Of course we can't. The thing is absurd. Domenichino might understand that. We must follow the lead of the Venetians, not they ours. I don't see that Domenichino is to blame. He has evidently done his best, and he can't do impossibilities. It's not in Domenichino that the fault lies. It's in the fact of his being one person instead of 2. We ought to have at least one responsible man to guard the store, and another to see the transports off. He is quite right. We must have efficient help." "But what help are we going to give him? We have no one in Florence to send." "Then I must go myself." She leaned back in her chair and looked at him with a little frown. "No, that won't do. It's too risky." "It will have to do if we can't find any other way out of the difficulty." "Then we must find another way, that's all. It's out of the question for you to go again just now." An obstinate line appeared at the corners of his under lip. "I don't see that it's out of the question." "You will see if you think about the thing calmly for a minute. It is only 5 weeks since you got back. The police are on the scent about that pilgrim business, and scouring the country to find a clue. Yes, I know you are clever at disguises. But remember what a lot of people saw you, both as Diego and as the countryman. And you can't disguise your lameness or the scar on your face." "There are plenty of lame people in the world." "Yes, but there are not plenty of people in the Romagna with a lame foot and a sabre cut across the cheek and a left arm injured like yours, and the combination of blue eyes with such dark colouring." "The eyes don't matter. I can alter them with belladonna." "You can't alter the other things." "No, it won't do. For you to go there just now, with all your identification marks, would be to walk into a trap with your eyes open. You would certainly be taken." "But someone must help Domenichino." "It will be no help to him to have you caught at a critical moment like this. Your arrest would mean the failure of the whole thing." But the Gadfly was difficult to convince, and the discussion went on without coming nearer to any settlement. Gemma was beginning to realize how nearly inexhaustible was the fund of quiet obstinacy in his character, and had the matter not been one about which she felt strongly, she would probably have yielded for the sake of peace. This, however, was a case in which she could not conscientiously give way. The practical advantage to be gained from the proposed journey seemed to her not sufficiently important to be worth the risk, and she could not help suspecting that his desire to go was prompted less by a conviction of grave political necessity than by a morbid craving for the excitement of danger. He had got into the habit of risking his neck, and his tendency to run into unnecessary perils seemed to her a form of intemperance, which should be quietly but steadily resisted. Finding all her arguments unavailing against his dogged resolve to go his own way, she fired her last shot. "Let us be honest about it anyway," she said, "and call things by their true names. It is not Domenichino's difficulty that makes you so determined to go. It is your own personal passion for—" "It's not true," he interrupted vehemently. "He is nothing to me. I don't care if I never see him again." He broke off, seeing in her face that he had betrayed himself. Their eyes met for an instant and dropped, and neither of them uttered the name that was in both their minds. It is not Domenichino I want to save," he stammered at last, with his face half buried in the cat's fur. "It is that I understand the danger of the work failing if he has no help. She passed over the feeble little subterfuge, and went on as if there had been no interruption. "It is your passion for running into danger which makes you want to go there. You have the same craving for danger when you are worried that you had for opium when you were ill." "It was not I that asked for the opium," he said defiantly. "It was the others who insisted on giving it to me." "I dare say. You plume yourself a little on your stoicism, and ask for physical relief would have hurt your pride. But it is rather flattered than otherwise when you risk your life to relieve the irritation of your nerves. And yet, after all, the distinction is a merely conventional one." He drew the cat's head back and looked down into the round green eyes. "Is it true, Pasht?" he said. "Are all these unkind things true that your mistress is saying about me? Is it a case of mea culpa, maxima culpa? You wise beast, you never ask for opium, do you? Your ancestors were gods in Egypt, and no man to trot on their tails. I wonder, though, what would become of your calm superiority to earthly ills if I were to take this paw of yours and hold it in the candle? Would you ask me for opium then? Would you? Or perhaps for death? No, pussy, we have no right to die for our personal convenience. We may spit and swear a bit if it consoles us, but we mustn't pull the paw away." "Hush!" She took the cat off his knee and put it down on a footstool. "You and I will have time for thinking about those things later on. What we have to think of now is how to get Domenichino out of his difficulty. What is it, Katie, a visitor? I am busy." "Miss Wright has sent you this, ma'am, by hand." The packet, which was carefully sealed, contained a letter addressed to Miss Wright, but unopened and with a papal stamp. Gemma's old school friends still lived in Florence, and her more important letters were often received, for safety, at their address. "It is Michel's mark," she said, glancing quickly over the letter, which seemed to be about the summer terms at a boarding-house in the Apennines, and pointing to 2 little blots on a corner of the page. "It is in chemical ink. The Regent is in the 3rd drawer of the writing-table. Yes, that is it." He laid the letter open on the desk and passed a little brush over its edges. When the real message stood out on the paper in a brilliant blue line, he leaned back in his chair and burst out laughing. "What is it?" she asked hurriedly. He handed her the paper. "Domenichino has been arrested. Come at once." She sat down with the paper in her hand and stared hopelessly at the Gadfly. Well," he said at last, with his soft, ironical drawl. "Are you satisfied now that I must go?" "Yes, I suppose you must," she answered, sighing. "And I too." He looked up with a little start. "You too? But, of course, it will be very awkward, I know, to be left without anyone here in Florence, but everything must go to the wall now except the providing of an extra pair of hands." "There are plenty of hands to be got there." "They don't belong to people whom you can trust thoroughly, though. You said yourself just now that there must be 2 responsible persons in charge, and if Domenichino couldn't manage alone, it is evidently impossible for you to do so. A person as desperately compromised as you are is very much handicapped, remember, in work of that kind, and more dependent on help than anyone else would be. Instead of you and Domenichino, it must be you and I." He considered for a moment, frowning. "Yes, you are quite right," he said, "and the sooner we go the better. But we must not start together. If I go off tonight, you can take, say, the afternoon coach tomorrow." "Where to?" "That we must discuss. I think I had better go straight in to Faenza. If I start late tonight and ride to Borgo San Lorenzo, I can get my disguise arranged there and go straight on." "I don't see what else we can do," she said, with an anxious little frown. "But it is very risky, your going off in such a hurry and trusting to the smugglers finding you a disguise at Borgo. You ought to have at least 3 clear days to double on your trace before you cross the frontier." "You needn't be afraid," he answered, smiling. "I may get taken further on, but not at the frontier. Once in the hills I am as safe as here. There's not a smuggler in the Apennines that would betray me. What I am not quite sure about is how you are to get across." "Oh, that is very simple. I shall take Louisa Wright's passport and go for a holiday. No one knows me in the Romagna, but every spy knows you." "Fortunately, so does every smuggler." She took out her watch. 2:30. "We have the afternoon and evening, then, if you are to start tonight." "Then the best thing will be for me to go home and settle everything now and arrange about a good horse. I shall ride in to San Lorenzo. It will be safer." "But it won't be safe at all to hire a horse. The owner will—" "I shan't hire one. I know a man that will lend me a horse, and that can be trusted. He has done things for me before. One of the shepherds will bring it back in a fortnight. I shall be here again by 5 or 5:30 then. And while I'm gone, I will want you to go and find Martini and explain everything to him." "Martini?" She turned around and looked at him in astonishment. Yes, we must take him into confidence, unless you can think of anyone else. I don't quite understand what you mean. We must have someone here whom we can trust in case of any special difficulty, and of all the set here, Martini is the man in whom I have most confidence. Riccardo would do anything he could for us, of course, but I think Martini has a steadier head. Still, you know him better than I do. It is as you think. I have not the slightest doubt as to Martini's trustworthiness and efficiency in every respect, and I think he would probably consent to give us any help he could, but he understood at once. Gemma, what would you feel if you found out that a comrade in bitter need had not asked you for help you might have given, for fear of hurting or distressing you? Would you say there was any true kindness in that? Very well, she said after a little pause. I will send Katie round at once and ask him to come, and while she is gone I will go to Louisa for her passport. She promised to lend it whenever I want one. What about money? Shall I draw some out of the bank? No, don't waste time on that. I can draw enough from my account to last us for a bit. We will fall back on yours later on if my balance runs short. Till 5:30 then. I shall be sure to find you here, of course. Oh, yes, I shall be back long before then. Half an hour after the appointed time he returned and found Gemma and Martini sitting on the terrace together. He saw at once that their conversation had been a distressing one. The traces of agitation were visible in both of them, and Martini was unusually silent and glum. "Have you arranged everything?" she asked, looking up. "Yes, and I have brought you some money for the journey. The horse will be ready for me at the Ponte Rosso barrier at 1 in the night. Is not that rather late? You ought to get into San Lorenzo before the people are up in the morning." "So I shall. It's a very fast horse, and I don't want to leave here when there's a chance of anyone noticing me. I shan't go home any more. There's a spy watching at the door, and he thinks me in." "How did you get out without his seeing you?" "Out of the kitchen window into the back garden, and over the neighbor's orchard wall. That's what makes me so late. I had to dodge him. I left the owner of the horse to sit in the study all the evening, with the lamp lighted. When the spy sees the light in the window and a shadow on the blind, he will be quite satisfied that I am writing at home this evening." "Then you will stay here till it is time to go to the barrier?" "Yes, I don't want to be seen in the street any more tonight. Have a cigar, Martini? I know Signora Bolla doesn't mind smoke." "I shan't be here to mind. I must go downstairs and help Katie with the dinner." When she had gone, Martini got up and began to pace to and fro with his hands behind his back. The Gadfly sat smoking and looking silently out at the drizzling rain. "Rivarez," Martini began, stopping in front of him, but keeping his eyes on the ground. "What sort of thing are you going to drive her into?" The Gadfly took the cigar from his mouth and blew away a long trail of smoke. "She has chosen for herself," he said, "without compulsion on anyone's part." Yes, I know. But tell me—" He stopped. "I will tell you anything I can." "Well, then, I don't know much about the details of these affairs in the hills. Are you going to take her into any very serious danger?" "Do you want the truth?" "Yes." "Then, yes." Martini turned away and went on pacing up and down. Presently he stopped again. "I want to ask you another question. If you don't choose to answer it, you needn't, of course, but if you do answer, then answer honestly. Are you in love with her?" The Gadfly deliberately knocked the ash from his cigar and went on smoking in silence. "That means that you don't choose to answer?" "No, only that I think I have a right to know why you ask me that." "Why? Good God, man, can't you see why?" "Ah!" He laid down his cigar and looked steadily at Martini. "Yes," he said at last, slowly and softly, "I am in love with her. But you needn't think I'm going to make love to her, or worry about it. I am only going to—" His voice died away in a strange, faint whisper. Martini came a step nearer. "Only going to die." He was staring straight before him with a cold, fixed look, as if he were dead already. When he spoke again, his voice was curiously lifeless and even. "You needn't worry her about it beforehand," he said. "But there's not the ghost of a chance for me. It's dangerous for everyone, that she knows as well as I do, but the smugglers will do their best to prevent her getting taken. They're good fellows, though they are a bit rough. As for me, the rope is around my neck, and when I cross the frontier I pull the noose." "Rivarez, what do you mean? Of course it's dangerous, and particularly so for you, I understand that, but you have often crossed the frontier before and always been successful." "Yes, and this time I shall fail." "But why? How can you know?" The Gadfly smiled drearily. "Do you remember the German legend of the man that died when he met his own double? No? It appeared to him at night in a lonely place, wringing its hands in despair. Well, I met mine the last time I was in the hills, and when I cross the frontier again I shan't come back." Martini came up to him and put a hand on the back of his chair. "Listen, Rivarez, I don't understand a word of all this metaphysical stuff, but I do understand one thing. If you feel about it that way, you are not in a fit state to go. The surest way to get taken is to go with the conviction that you will be taken. You must be ill or out of sorts somehow to get maggots of that kind into your head. Suppose I go instead of you. I can do any practical work there is to be done, and you can send a message to your men explaining, and let you get killed instead. That would be very clever." "Oh, I'm not likely to get killed. They don't know me as they do you, and besides, even if I did—" He stopped, and the Gadfly looked up with a slow, inquiring gaze. Martini's hand dropped by his side. "She very likely wouldn't miss me as much as she would you," he said in his most matter-of-fact voice. "And then, besides, Rivarez, this is a public business, and we have to look at it from the point of view of utility, the greatest good of the greatest number. Your final value, isn't that what the economists call it, is higher than mine. I have brains enough to see that, though I haven't any cause to be particularly fond of you. You are a bigger man than I am. I'm not sure that you are a better one, but there's more of you, and your death would be a greater loss than mine." From the way he spoke, he might have been discussing the value of shares on the exchange. The Gadfly looked up, shivering as if with cold. "Would you have me wait till my grave opens of itself to swallow me up? If I must die, I will encounter darkness as a bride. Look here, Martini, you and I are talking nonsense." "You are, certainly," said Martini gruffly. "Yes, and so are you. For heaven's sake, don't let's go in for romantic self-sacrifice like Don Carlos and Marquis Posa. This is the 19th century, and if it's my business to die, I have got to do it. And if it's my business to live, I've got to do that, I suppose. You're the lucky one, Rivarez." "Yes," the Gadfly assented laconically. "I was always lucky." They smoked in silence for a few minutes, and then began to talk of business details. When Gemma came up to call them to dinner, neither of them betrayed in face or manner that their conversation had been in any way unusual. After dinner they sat discussing plans and making necessary arrangements till 11 o'clock, when Martini rose and took his hat. "I will go home and fetch that riding cloak of mine, Rivarez. I think you will be less recognizable in it than in your light suit. I want to reconnoitre a bit, too, and make sure there are no spies about before we start." "Are you coming with me to the barrier?" "Yes. It's safer to have 4 eyes than 2 in case of anyone following you. I'll be back by 12. Be sure you don't start without me. I'd better take the key, Gemma, so as not to wake anyone by ringing." She raised her eyes to his face as he took the keys. She understood that he had invented a pretext in order to leave her alone with the Gadfly. "You and I will talk tomorrow," she said. "We shall have time in the morning when my packing is finished." "Oh, yes, plenty of time. There are 2 or 3 little things I want to ask you about, Rivarez, but we can talk them over on our way to the barrier. You had better send Katie to bed, Gemma, and be as quiet as you can, both of you. Goodbye till 12, then." He went away with a little nod and smile, banging the door after him to let the neighbours hear that Signora Bolla's visitor was gone. Gemma went out into the kitchen to say good-night to Katie, and came back with black coffee on a tray. "Would you like to lie down a bit?" she said. "You won't have any sleep the rest of the night." "Oh, dear no, I shall sleep at San Lorenzo while the men are getting my disguise ready." "Then have some coffee. Wait a minute, I will get you out the biscuits." As she knelt down at the sideboard, he suddenly stooped over her shoulder. "Whatever have you got there? Chocolate creams and English toffee. Why, this is a luxury for a king." She looked up, smiling faintly at his enthusiastic tone. "Are you fond of sweets? I always keep them for Cesare. He is a perfect baby over any kind of lollipops." "Really? Well, you must get him some more tomorrow and give me these to take with me. No, let me put the toffee in my pocket. It will console me for all the lost joys of life. I do hope they'll give me a bit of toffee to suck, the damn hanged. Oh, do let me find a cardboard box for it, at least, before you put it in your pocket. You will be so sticky. Shall I put the chocolates in, too?" "No, I want to eat them now, with you." "But I don't like chocolate. I want you to come and sit down like a reasonable human being. You very likely shan't have another chance to talk quietly before one or other of us is killed, and—" "She doesn't like chocolate," he murmured under his breath. "Then I must be greedy all by myself. This is a case of the hangman's supper, isn't it? You are going to humour all my whims tonight. First of all, I want you to sit on this easy chair, and as you said I might lie down, I shall lie here and be comfortable." He threw himself down on the rug at her feet, leaning his elbow on the chair and looking up into her face. "How pale you are," he said. "That's because you take life sadly and don't like chocolate. Do be serious for just 5 minutes. After all, it is a matter of life and death." "Not even for 2 minutes, dear. Neither life nor death is worth it." He had taken hold of both her hands and was stroking them with the tips of his fingers. "Don't look so grave, Minerva. You'll make me cry in a minute, and then you'll be sorry. I do wish you'd smile again. You have such a delightfully unexpected smile. There now, don't scold me, dear. Let us eat our biscuits together like 2 good children without quarrelling over them, for tomorrow we die." He took a sweet biscuit from the plate and carefully halved it, breaking the sugar ornament down the middle with scrupulous exactness. "This is a kind of sacrament, like what the goody-goody people have in church. Take, eat, this is my body. And we must drink the wine out of the same glass, you know. Yes, that is right. Do this in remembrance." She put down the glass. "Don't!" she said with almost a sob. He looked up and took her hands again. "Hush, then. Let us be quiet for a little bit. When one of us dies, the other will remember this. We will forget this loud, insistent world that howls about our ears. We will go away together, hand in hand. We will go away into the secret halls of death and lie among the poppy flowers. Hush! We will be quite still." He laid his head down against her knee and covered his face. In the silence she bent over him, her hand on the black head. So the time slipped on, and they neither moved nor spoke. "Dear, it is almost 12, she said at last. He raised his head. "We have only a few minutes more. Martini will be back presently. Perhaps we shall never see each other again. Have you nothing to say to me?" He slowly rose and walked away to the other side of the room. There was a moment's silence. "I have one thing to say," he began in a hardly audible voice. "One thing to tell you." He stopped and sat down by the window, hiding his face in both hands. "You have been a long time deciding to be merciful," she said softly. "I have not seen much mercy in my life, and I thought, at first, you wouldn't care." "You don't think that now." She waited a moment for him to speak, and then crossed the room and stood beside him. "Tell me the truth at last," she whispered. "Think, if you are killed and I not, I should have to go through all my life and never know, never be quite sure." He took her hands and clasped them tightly. "If I am killed... You see, when I went to South America... Ah, Martini!" He broke away with a violent start and threw open the door of the room. Martini was rubbing his boots on the mat. "Punctual to the minute as usual. You're an animated chronometer, Martini. Is that the riding cloak?" "Yes, and 2 or 3 other things. I have kept them as dry as I could, but it's pouring with rain. You will have a most uncomfortable ride, I'm afraid." "Oh, that's no matter. Is the street clear?" "Yes, all the spies seem to have gone to bed." "I don't much wonder, either, on such a villainous night. Is that coffee, Gemma? He ought to have something hot before he goes out into the wet, or he will catch cold." "It is black coffee and very strong. I will boil some milk." She went into the kitchen, passionately clenching her teeth and hands to keep from breaking down. When she returned with the milk, the Gadfly had put on the riding cloak and was fastening the leather gaiters which Martini had brought. He drank a cup of coffee, standing, and took up the broad-brimmed riding hat. "I think it's time to start, Martini. We must make a round before we go to the barrier in case of anything. Goodbye for the present, Signora. I shall meet you at Forlì on Friday, then, unless anything special turns up. Wait a minute. This is the address." He tore a leaf out of his pocketbook and wrote a few words in pencil. "I have it already," she said in a dull, quiet voice. "Have you? Well, there it is anyway. Come, Martini. Shh, shh. Don't let the door creak." They crept softly downstairs. When the street door clicked behind them, she went back into the room and mechanically unfolded the paper he had put into her hand. Underneath the address was written, "I will tell you everything there." End of Chapter 1 of the 3rd part. Recording by Daria.
Part 3, Chapter 2 of The Gadfly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gloria Begemann, Somerville, South Carolina. The Gadfly by Ethel Lilian VOYNICH. Part 3, Chapter 2. It was market day in Brisighella, and the country folk had come in from the villages and hamlets of the district, with their pigs and poultry, their dairy produce, and droves of half-wild mountain cattle. The marketplace was thronged with a perpetually shifting crowd, laughing, joking, bargaining for dried figs, cheap cakes, and sunflower seeds. The brown, barefooted children sprawled, face downward, on the pavement in the hot sun, while their mothers sat under the trees with their baskets of butter and eggs. Monsignor Montanelli, coming out to wish the people good morning, was at once surrounded by a clamorous throng of children, holding up for his acceptance great bunches of irises and scarlet poppies and sweet white narcissus from the mountain slopes. His passion for wildflowers was affectionately tolerated by the people, as one of the little follies which sit gracefully on very wise men. If anyone less universally beloved had filled his house with weeds and grasses, they would have laughed at him, but the blessed cardinal could afford a few harmless eccentricities. "Well, Mariuccia," he said, stopping to pat one of the children on the head, "you have grown since I saw you last. And how is the grandmother's rheumatism?" "She's been better lately, Your Eminence, but Mother's bad now." "I'm sorry to hear that. Tell the mother to come down here some day and see whether Dr. Giordani can do anything for her. I will find somewhere to put her up. Perhaps the change will do her good. You are looking better, Luigi. How are your eyes?" He passed on, chatting with the mountaineers. He always remembered the names and ages of the children, their troubles and those of their parents, and would stop to inquire with sympathetic interest for the health of the cow that fell sick at Christmas, or of the rag doll that was crushed under a cartwheel last market day. When he returned to the palace, the marketing began. A lame man in a blue shirt, with a shock of black hair hanging into his eyes and a deep scar across the left cheek, lounged up to one of the booths and in a very bad Italian asked for a drink of lemonade. "You're not from these parts," said the woman who poured it out, glancing up at him. "No, I come from Corsica." "Looking for work?" "Yes, it will be hay-cutting time soon, and a gentleman that has a farm near Ravenna came across to Bastia the other day and told me there's plenty of work to be got there." "I hope you'll find it so, I'm sure, but times are bad hereabouts." "They're worse in Corsica, Mother. I don't know what we poor folk are coming to." "Have you come over alone?" "No, my mate is with me. There he is, in the red shirt." "Hola, Paolo!" Michele, hearing himself called, came lounging up with his hands in his pockets. He made a fairly good Corsican, in spite of the red wig which he had put on to render himself unrecognizable. As for the Gadfly, he looked his part to perfection. They sauntered through the marketplace together, Michele whistling between his teeth, and the Gadfly trudging along with a bundle over his shoulder, shuffling his feet on the ground to render his lameness less observable. They were waiting for an emissary to whom important directions had to be given. "There's Marconi, on horseback, at that corner," Michele whispered suddenly. The Gadfly, still carrying his bundle, shuffled toward the horseman. "Do you happen to be wanting a haymaker, sir?" he said, touching his ragged cap and running one finger along the bridle. It was the signal agreed upon, and the rider, who from his appearance might have been a country squire's bailiff, dismounted and threw the reins on the horse's neck. "What sort of work can you do, my man?" The Gadfly fumbled with his cap. "I can cut grass, sir, and trim hedges," he began, and without any break in his voice went straight on. "At 1 a.m, at the mouth of the round cave, you must have 2 good horses and a cart. I shall be waiting inside the cave, and then I can dig, sir, and—" "That will do. I only want a grass cutter. Have you ever been out before?" "Once, sir." "Mind, you must come well armed. We may meet a flying squadron. Don't go by the wood path. You're safer on the other side." If you meet a spy, don't stop to argue with him. Fire at once." "I should be very glad of work, sir." "Yes, I dare say, but I want an experienced grass cutter." "No, I haven't got any coppers to-day." A very ragged beggar had slouched up to them with a doleful, monotonous whine. "Have pity on a poor blind man, in the name of the Blessed Virgin. Get out of this place at once. There's a flying squadron coming along. Most Holy Queen of Heaven, maiden undefiled, it's you they're after, Rivarez. They'll be here in 2 minutes. And so may the saints reward you. You'll have to make a dash for it. There are spies at all the corners. It's no use trying to slip away without being seen." Marconi slipped the reins into the Gadfly's hand. "Make haste. Ride out to the bridge and let the horse go. You can hide in the ravine. We're all armed. We can keep them back for 10 minutes. No, I won't have you fellows taken. Stand together, all of you, and fire after me in order. Move up towards our horses. There they are, tethered by the palace steps. And have your knives ready. We retreat fighting, and when I throw my cap down, cut the halters and jump every man on the nearest horse. We may all reach the wood that way." They had spoken in so quiet an undertone that even the nearest bystanders had not supposed their conversation to refer to anything more dangerous than grass cutting. Marconi, leading his own mare by the bridle, walked toward the tethered horses, the Gadfly slouching along beside him, and the beggar following them with an outstretched hand and a persistent whine. Michele coming up whistling. The beggar had warned him in passing, and he quietly handed on the news to 3 countrymen who were eating raw onions under a tree. They immediately rose and followed him, and before anyone's notice had been attracted to them, the whole 7 were standing together by the steps of the palace, each man with one hand on the hidden pistol and the tethered horses within easy reach. "Don't betray yourselves till I move," the Gadfly said softly and clearly. "They may not recognize us. When I fire, then begin in order. Don't fire at the men. Lame their horses, then they can't follow us. 3 of you fire, while the other 3 reload. If anyone comes between you and our horses, kill him. I take the roan. When I throw down my cap, each man for himself. Don't stop for anything." "Here they come," said Michele, and the Gadfly turned round with an air of naive and stupid wonder, as the people suddenly broke off in their bargaining. 15 armed men rode slowly into the marketplace. They had great difficulty to get past the throng of people at all, and, but for the spies at the corners of the square, all the 7 conspirators could have slipped quietly away while the attention of the crowd was fixed upon the soldiers. Michele moved a little closer to the Gadfly. "Couldn't we get away now?" "No, we're surrounded with spies, and one of them has recognized me. He has just sent a man to tell the captain where I am. Our only chance is to lame their horses." "Which is the spy?" "The first man I fire at. Are you all ready? They have made a lane to us. They are going to come with a rush." "Out of the way there!" shouted the captain. "In the name of His Holiness!" The crowd had drawn back, startled and wondering, and the soldiers made a quick dash towards the little group standing by the palace steps. The Gadfly drew a pistol from his blouse and fired, not at the advancing troops, but at the spy who was approaching the horses, and who fell back with a broken collarbone. Immediately after the report, 6 more shots were fired in quick succession, as the conspirators moved steadily closer to the tethered horses. One of the cavalry horses stumbled and plunged. Another fell to the ground with a fearful cry. Then, through the shrieking of the panic-stricken people, came the loud, imperious voice of the officer in command, who had risen in the stirrups and was holding a sword above his head. "This way, men!" He swayed in the saddle and sank back. The Gadfly had fired again with his deadly aim. A little stream of blood was trickling down the captain's uniform, but he steadied himself with a violent effort, and clutching at his horse's mane, cried out fiercely, "Kill that lame devil if you can't take him alive! It's Rivera's!" "Another pistol, quick!" the Gadfly called to his men, "and go!" He flung down his cap. It was only just in time, for the swords of the now infuriated soldiers were flashing close in front of him. "Put down your weapons, all of you!" Cardinal Montanelli had stepped suddenly between the combatants, and one of the soldiers cried out in a voice sharp with terror, "Your Eminence! My God, you'll be murdered!" Montanelli only moved a step nearer and faced the Gadfly's pistol. 5 of the conspirators were already on horseback and dashing up the hilly street. Marconi sprang onto the back of his mare. In the moment of riding away, he glanced back to see whether his leader was in need of help. The roan was close at hand, and in another instant all would have been safe. But as the figure in the scarlet cassock stepped forward, the Gadfly suddenly wavered, and the hand with the pistol sank down. The instant decided everything. Immediately he was surrounded and flung violently to the ground, and the weapon was dashed out of his hand by a blow from the flat of a soldier's sword. Marconi struck his mare's flank with the stirrup. The hoofs of the cavalry horses were thundering up the hill behind him, and it would have been worse than useless to stay and be taken too. Turning in the saddle as he galloped away to fire a last shot in the teeth of the nearest pursuer, he saw the Gadfly, with blood on his face, trampled under the feet of horses and soldiers and spies, and heard the savage curses of the captors, the yells of triumph and rage. Montanelli did not notice what had happened. He had moved away from the steps and was trying to calm the terrified people. Presently, as he stooped over the wounded spy, a startled movement of the crowd made him look up. The soldiers were crossing the square, dragging their prisoner after them by the rope with which his hands were tied. His face was livid with pain and exhaustion, and he panted fearfully for breath. But he looked round at the Cardinal, smiling with white lips, and whispered, "I congratulate your Eminence." 5 days later, Martini reached Forli. He had received from Gemma by post a bundle of printed circulars, the signal agreed upon in case of his being needed in any special emergency, and, remembering the conversation on the terrace, he guessed the truth at once. All through the journey he kept repeating to himself that there was no reason for supposing anything to have happened to the Gadfly, and that it was absurd to attach any importance to the childish superstitions of so nervous and fanciful a person. But the more he reasoned with himself against the idea, the more firmly did it take possession of his mind. "I have guessed what it is. Rivera's is taken, of course," he said, as he came into Gemma's room. "He was arrested last Thursday at Brisighella. He defended himself desperately and wounded the captain of the squadron and a spy." "Armed resistance. That's bad." "It makes no difference. He was too deeply compromised already for a pistol shot, more or less, to affect his position much." "What do you think they are going to do with him?" She grew a shade paler even than before. "I think," she said, "that we must not wait to find out what they mean to do." "You think we shall be able to effect a rescue?" "We must." He turned away and began to whistle, with his hands behind his back. Gemma let him think undisturbed. She was sitting still, leaning her head against the back of the chair and looking out into vague distance with a fixed and tragic absorption. When her face wore that expression, it had a look of dur's melancholia. "Have you seen him?" Martini asked, stopping for a moment in his tramp. "No, he was to have met me here the next morning." Yes, I remember. Where is he? In the fortress, very strictly guarded, and, they say, in chains. He made a gesture of indifference. Oh, that's no matter. A good file will get rid of any number of chains, if only he isn't wounded. He seems to have been slightly hurt, but exactly how much we don't know. I think you had better hear the account of it from Michaela himself. He was present at the arrest. How does he come not to have been taken too? Did he run away and leave Rivarez in the lurch? It's not his fault. He fought as long as anybody did, and followed the directions given to him to the letter. For that matter, so did they all. The only person who seems to have forgotten, or somehow made a mistake at the last minute, is Rivarez himself. There's something inexplicable about it altogether. Wait a minute. I will call Michaela." She went out of the room and presently came back with Michaela and a broad-shouldered mountaineer. "This is Marco," she said. "You have heard of him. He is one of the smugglers. He has just got here and perhaps will be able to tell us more. Michaela, this is Cesare Martini, that I spoke to you about. Will you tell him what happened, as far as you saw it?" Michaela gave a short account of the skirmish with the squadron. "I can't understand how it happened," he concluded. "Not one of us would have left him if we had thought he would be taken, but his directions were quite precise, and it never occurred to us when he threw down his cap that he would wait to let them surround him. He was close beside the roan. I saw him cut the tether, and I handed him a loaded pistol myself before I mounted. The only thing I can suppose is that he missed his footing, being lame, in trying to mount. But even then, he could have fired." "No, it wasn't that," Marconi interposed. "He didn't attempt to mount. I was the last one to go, because my mare shied at the firing, and I looked round to see whether he was safe. He would have got off clear if it hadn't have been for the Cardinal." "Ah!" Gemma exclaimed softly, and Martini repeated in amazement. "The Cardinal?" "Yes, he threw himself in front of the pistol, confound him. I suppose Rivarez must have been startled, for he dropped his pistol hand and put the other one up like this," laying the back of his left wrist across his eyes, "and of course they all rushed on him." "I can't make that out," said Michaela. "It's not like Rivarez to lose his head at a crisis." "Probably he lowered his pistol for fear of killing an unarmed man," Martini put in. Michaela shrugged his shoulders. "Unarmed men shouldn't poke their noses into the middle of a fight. War is war. If Rivarez had put a bullet into his Eminence, instead of letting himself be caught like a tame rabbit, there'd be one honest man the more and one priest the less." He turned away, biting his mustache. His anger was very near to breaking down in tears. "Anyway," said Martini, "the thing's done, and there's no use wasting time in discussing how it happened. The question now is how we're to arrange an escape for him. I suppose you're all willing to risk it?" Michaela did not even condescend to answer the superfluous question, and the smuggler only remarked with a little laugh, "I'd shoot my own brother if he weren't willing." "Very well, then. First thing, have you got a plan of the fortress?" Gemma unlocked a drawer and took out several sheets of paper. "I have made out all the plans. Here is the ground floor of the fortress. Here are the upper and lower stories of the towers, and here the plan of the ramparts. These are the roads leading to the valley, and here are the paths and hiding places in the mountains and the underground passages. Do you know which of the towers he is in?" "The east one, in the round room with the grated window. I have marked it on the plan." "How did you get your information?" "From a man nicknamed the Cricket, a soldier of the guard. He is cousin to one of our men, Gino." "You have been quick about it." "There's no time to lose. Gino went into Brisighella at once, and some of the plans we already had. That list of hiding places was made by Rivera's himself. You can see by the handwriting." "What sort of men are the soldiers of the guard?" "That we have not been able to find out yet. The Cricket has only just come to the place and knows nothing about the other men. We must find out from Gino what the Cricket himself is like. Is anything known of the government's intentions? Is Rivera's likely to be tried in Brisighella or taken into Ravenna?" "That we don't know. Ravenna, of course, is the chief town of the legation, and by law cases of importance can be tried only there, in the tribunal of first instance. But law doesn't count for much in the four legations. It depends on the personal fancy of anybody who happens to be in power." "They won't take him into Ravenna," Michaela interposed. "What makes you think so?" "I am sure of it. Colonel Ferrari, the military governor at Brisighella, is uncle to the officer that Rivera's wounded. He's a vindictive sort of brute, and won't give up a chance to spite an enemy." "You think he will try to keep Rivera's here?" "I think he will try to get him hanged." Martini glanced quickly at Gemma. She was very pale, but her face had not changed at the words. Evidently the idea was no new one to her. "He can hardly do that without some formality," she said quietly. "But he might possibly get up a court-martial on some pretext or other, and justify himself afterwards by saying that the peace of the town required it." "But what about the Cardinal? Would he consent to things of that kind?" "He has no jurisdiction in military affairs." "No, but he has great influence. Surely the governor would not venture on such a step without his consent." "He'll never get that," Marconi interrupted. "Montanelli was always against the military commissions and everything of the kind. So long as they keep him in Brisighella, nothing serious can happen. The Cardinal will always take the part of any prisoner. What I am afraid of is their taking him to Ravenna. Once there, he's lost." "We shouldn't let him get there," said Michaela. "We could manage a rescue on the road, but to get him out of the fortress here is another matter." "I think," said Gemma, "that it would be quite useless to wait for the chance of his being transferred to Ravenna. We must make the attempt at Brisighella, and we have no time to lose. Cesare, you and I had better go over the plan of the fortress together and see whether we can think out anything. I have an idea in my head, but I can't get over one point." "Come, Marconi," said Michaela, rising. "We will leave them to think out their scheme. I have to go across to Fognano this afternoon, and I want you to come with me. Vincenzo hasn't sent those cartridges, and they ought to have been here yesterday." When the two men had gone, Martini went up to Gemma and silently held out his hand. She let her fingers lie in his for a moment. "You were always a good friend, Cesare," she said at last, "and a very present help in trouble. And now let us discuss plans." End of chapter 2 of the third part. Part 3, Chapter 3 of The Gadfly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gloria Begemann, Somerville, South Carolina. The Gadfly by Ethel Lilian VOYNICH. Part 3, Chapter 3. And I once more earnestly assure your Eminence that your refusal is endangering the peace of the town. The governor tried to preserve the respectful tone due to a high dignitary of the church, but there was audible irritation in his voice. His liver was out of order, his wife was running up heavy bills, and his temper had been sorely tried during the last 3 weeks. A sullen, disaffected populace, whose dangerous mood grew daily more apparent, a district honeycombed with plots and bristling with hidden weapons, an inefficient garrison of whose loyalty he was more than doubtful, and a cardinal whom he had pathetically described to his adjutant as the incarnation of immaculate pig-headedness, had already reduced him to the verge of desperation. Now he was saddled with the Gadfly, an animated quintessence of the spirit of mischief. Having begun by disabling both the governor's favourite nephew and his most valuable spy, the crooked Spanish devil had followed up his exploits in the marketplace by suborning the guards, browbeating the interrogating officers, and turning the prison into a bear garden. He had now been 3 weeks in the fortress, and the authorities of Brisighella were heartily sick of their bargain. They had subjected him to interrogation upon interrogation, and after employing, to obtain admission from him, every device of threat, persuasion, and stratagem which their ingenuity could suggest, remained just as wise as on the day of his capture. They had begun to realize that it would perhaps have been better to send him into Ravenna at once. It was, however, too late to rectify the mistake. The governor, when sending in to the legate his report of the arrest, had begged, as a special favour, permission to superintend personally the investigation of this case, and, his request having been graciously acceded to, he could not now withdraw without a humiliating confession that he was overmatched. The idea of settling the difficulty by a court-martial had, as Gemma and Michaela had foreseen, presented itself to him as the only satisfactory solution, and Cardinal Montanelli's stubborn refusal to countenance this was the last drop which made the cup of his vexation overflow. "I think," he said, "that if your Eminence knew what I and my assistants have put up with from this man, you would feel differently about the matter. I fully understand and respect the conscientious objection to irregularities in judicial proceedings, but this is an exceptional case and calls for exceptional measures." "There is no case," Montanelli answered, "which calls for injustice, and to condemn a civilian by the judgment of a secret military tribunal is both unjust and illegal. The case amounts to this, your Eminence. The prisoner is manifestly guilty of several capital crimes. He joined the infamous attempt of Savino, and the military commission nominated by Monsignor Spinola would certainly have had him shot or sent to the galleys then, had he not succeeded in escaping to Tuscany. Since that time he has never ceased plotting. He is known to be an influential member of one of the most pestilent secret societies in the country. He is gravely suspected of having consented to, if not inspired, the assassination of no less than 3 confidential police agents. He has been caught, one might also say, in the act of smuggling firearms into the legation. He has offered armed resistance to authority and seriously wounded 2 officials in the discharge of their duty, and he is now a standing menace to the peace and order of the town. Surely, in such a case, a court-martial is justifiable." "Whatever the man has done," Montanelli replied, "he has the right to be judged according to law." "The ordinary course of law involves delay, your Eminence, and in this case every moment is precious. Besides everything else, I am in constant terror of his escaping. If there is any danger of that, it rests with you to guard him more closely." "I do my best, your Eminence, but I am dependent upon the prison staff, and the man seems to have bewitched them all. I have changed the guard 4 times within 3 weeks. I have punished the soldiers till I am tired of it, and nothing is of any use. I can't prevent their carrying letters backwards and forwards. The fools are in love with him as if he were a woman." "That is very curious. There must be something remarkable about him." "There's a remarkable amount of devilry, I beg pardon, Your Eminence. But really this man is enough to try the patience of a saint. It's hardly credible, but I have to conduct all the interrogations myself, for the regular officer cannot stand it any longer." "How is that?" "It's difficult to explain, Your Eminence, but you would understand if you had once heard the way he goes on. One might think the interrogating officer were the criminal and he the judge." "But what is there so terrible that he can do?" "He can refuse to answer your questions, of course, but he has no weapon except silence." "And a tongue like a razor. We are all mortal, Your Eminence, and most of us have made mistakes in our time that we don't want published on the housetops. That's only human nature, and it's hard on a man to have his little slips of 20 years ago raked up and thrown in his teeth." "Has Rivarez brought up some personal secret of the interrogating officer?" "Well, really, the poor fellow got into debt when he was a cavalry officer, and borrowed a little sum from the regimental funds." "Stole public money that had been entrusted to him, in fact?" "Of course it was very wrong, Your Eminence, but his friends paid it back at once, and the affair was hushed up. He comes of a good family, and ever since then he has been irreproachable. How Rivarez found out about it I can't conceive, but the first thing he did at interrogation was to bring up this old scandal, before the subaltern too, and with as innocent a face as if he were saying his prayers. Of course the story's all over the legation by now. If Your Eminence would only be present at one of the interrogations, I am sure you would realize. He needn't know anything about it. You might overhear him from—" Montanelli turned round and looked at the governor with an expression which his face did not often wear. "I am a minister of religion," he said, "not a police spy, and eavesdropping forms no part of my professional duties. I didn't mean to give offence. I think we shall not get any good out of discussing this question further. If you will send the prisoner here, I will have a talk with him." "I venture very respectfully to advise Your Eminence not to attempt it. The man is perfectly incorrigible. It would be both safer and wiser to overstep the letter of the law for this once, and get rid of him before he does any more mischief. It is with great diffidence that I venture to press the point after what Your Eminence has said. But after all, I am responsible to Monsignor the Legate for the order of the town." "And I," Montanelli interrupted, "am responsible to God and His Holiness that there shall be no underhand dealing in my diocese. Since you press me in the matter, Colonel, I take my stand upon my privilege as cardinal. I will not allow a secret court-martial in this town in peacetime. I will receive the prisoner here, and alone, at 10 tomorrow morning." "As Your Eminence pleases," the governor replied with sulky respectfulness, and went away, grumbling to himself. "They're about a pair as far as obstinacy goes." He told no one of the approaching interview till it was actually time to knock off the prisoner's chains and start for the palace. It was quite enough, as he remarked to his wounded nephew, to have this most eminent son of Balaam's ass laying down the law, without running any risk of the soldiers plotting with Rivarez and his friends to effect an escape on the way. When the Gadfly, strongly guarded, entered the room where Montanelli was writing at a table covered with papers, a sudden recollection came over him of a hot midsummer afternoon when he had sat turning over manuscript sermons in a study much like this. The shutters had been closed, as they were here, to keep out the heat, and a fruit seller's voice outside had called, "Fragula, Fragula." He shook the hair angrily back from his eyes and set his mouth in a smile. Montanelli looked up from his papers. "You can wait in the hall," he said to the guards. "May it please your Eminence," began the sergeant, in a lowered voice and with evident nervousness, "the colonel thinks that this prisoner is dangerous, and that it would be better—" A sudden flash came into Montanelli's eyes. "You can wait in the hall," he repeated quietly, and the sergeant, saluting and stammering excuses with a frightened face, left the room with his men. "Sit down, please," said the Cardinal, when the door was shut. The Gadfly obeyed in silence. "Signor Rivarez," Montanelli began after a pause, "I wish to ask you a few questions, and shall be very much obliged to you if you will answer them." The Gadfly smiled. "My chief occupation at present is to be asked questions." "And not to answer them? So I have heard. But these questions are put by officials who are investigating your case, and whose duty is to use your answers as evidence." "And those of your Eminence?" There was a covert insult in the tone more than in the words, and the Cardinal understood it at once, but his face did not lose its grave sweetness of expression. "Mine," he said, "whether you answer them or not, will remain between you and me. If they should trench upon your political secrets, of course you will not answer. Otherwise, though we are complete strangers to each other, I hope that you will do so as a personal favour to me." "I am entirely at the service of your Eminence." He said it with a little bow and a face that would have taken the heart to ask favours out of the daughters of the horse leech. "First, then, you are said to have been smuggling firearms into this district. What are they wanted for?" To kill rats with." "That is a terrible answer. Are all your fellow men rats in your eyes if they cannot think as you do?" Some of them." Montanelli leaned back in his chair and looked at him in silence for a little while. "What is that on your hand?" he asked suddenly. The Gadfly glanced at his left hand. "Old marks from the teeth of some of the rats." "Excuse me? I was speaking of the other hand. That is a fresh hurt." The slender, flexible right hand was badly cut and grazed. The Gadfly held it up. The wrist was swollen, and across it ran a deep and long black bruise. "It is a mere trifle, as you see," he said. "When I was arrested the other day, thanks to your Eminence," he made another little bow, "one of the soldiers stamped on it." Montanelli took the wrist and examined it closely. "How does it come to be in such a state now, after 3 weeks?" he asked. "It is all inflamed." "Possibly the pressure of the iron has not done it much good." The Cardinal looked up with a frown. "Have they been putting irons on a fresh wound?" Naturally, your Eminence. That is what fresh wounds are for. Old wounds are not much use. They will only ache. You can't make them burn properly." Montanelli looked at him again in the same close, scrutinizing way, then rose and opened a drawer full of surgical appliances. "Give me the hand," he said. The Gadfly, with a face as hard as beaten iron, held out the hand, and Montanelli, after bathing the injured place, gently bandaged it. Evidently he was accustomed to such work. "I will speak about the irons," he said. "And now I want to ask you another question. What do you propose to do?" That is very simply answered, your Eminence. To escape if I can, and if I can't, to die." "Why to die?" "Because if the governor doesn't succeed in getting me shot, I shall be sent to the galleys. And for me, that comes to the same thing. I have not got the health to live through it." Montanelli rested his arm on the table and pondered silently. The Gadfly did not disturb him. He was leaning back with half-shut eyes, lazily enjoying the delicious physical sensations of relief from the chains. "Supposing," Montanelli began again, "that you were to succeed in escaping, what should you do with your life?" "I have already told your Eminence I should kill rats." "You would kill rats. That is to say, that if I were to let you escape from here now, supposing I had the power to do so, you would use your freedom to foster violence and bloodshed instead of preventing them." The Gadfly raised his eyes to the crucifix on the wall. "Not peace, but a sword. At least I should be in good company. For my own part, though, I prefer pistols." "Signor Rivarez," said the Cardinal with unruffled composure, "I have not insulted you as yet, or spoken slightingly of your beliefs or friends. May I not expect the same courtesy from you, or do you wish me to suppose that an atheist cannot be a gentleman?" "Ah, I quite forgot. Your Eminence places courtesy high among the Christian virtues. I remember your sermon in Florence on the occasion of my controversy with your anonymous defender. That is one of the subjects about which I wished to speak to you. Would you mind explaining to me the reason of the peculiar bitterness you seem to feel against me? If you have simply picked me out as a convenient target, that is another matter. Your methods of political controversy are your own affair, and we are not discussing politics now. But I fancied at the time that there was some personal animosity towards me, and if so, I should be glad to know whether I have ever done you wrong or in any way given you cause for such a feeling." "Ever done him wrong?" The Gadfly put up the bandaged hand to his throat. "I must refer your Eminence to Shakespeare," he said with a little laugh. "It's as with the man who can't endure a harmless, necessary cat. My antipathy is a priest. The sight of the cassock makes my teeth ache." "Oh, if it is only that." Montanelli dismissed the subject with an indifferent gesture. "Still," he added, "abuse is one thing and perversion of fact is another. When you stated, in answer to my sermon, that I knew the identity of the anonymous writer, you made a mistake. I do not accuse you of wilful falsehood, and stated what was untrue. I am to this day quite ignorant of his name." The Gadfly put his head on one side, like an intelligent robin, looked at him for a moment gravely, then suddenly threw himself back and burst into a peal of laughter. "Sancta simplicitas! Oh, you sweet, innocent Arcadian people! And you never guessed, you never saw the cloven hoof?" Montanelli stood up. "Am I to understand, Signor Rivarez, that you wrote both sides of the controversy yourself?" "It was a shame, I know," the Gadfly answered, looking up with wide, innocent blue eyes. "And you swallowed everything whole, just as if it had been an oyster. It was very wrong, but oh, it was so funny." Montanelli bit his lip and sat down again. He had realized from the first that the Gadfly was trying to make him lose his temper, and had resolved to keep it whatever happened. But he was beginning to find excuses for the governor's exasperation. A man who had been spending 2 hours a day for the last 3 weeks in interrogating the Gadfly might be pardoned an occasional swear word. "We will drop that subject," he said quietly. "What I want to see you for particularly is this. My position here as Cardinal gives me some voice, if I choose to claim my privilege, in the question of what is to be done with you. The only use to which I should ever put such a privilege would be to interfere in case of any violence to you which was not necessary to prevent you from doing violence to others. I sent for you, therefore, partly in order to ask whether you have anything to complain of. I will see about the irons, but perhaps there is something else, and partly because I felt it right, before giving my opinion, to see for myself what sort of man you are." "I have nothing to complain of, your Eminence. Alla guardia, cum alla guardia. I am not a schoolboy to expect any government to pat me on the head for smuggling firearms onto its territory. It's only natural that they should hit as hard as they can. As for what sort of man I am, you have had a romantic confession of my sins once. Is not that enough? Or would you like me to begin again?" "I don't understand you," Montanelli said coldly, taking up a pencil and twisting it between his fingers. "Surely your Eminence has not forgotten old Diego the pilgrim?" He suddenly changed his voice and began to speak as Diego. "I am a miserable sinner." The pencil snapped in Montanelli's hand. "That is too much," he said. The Gadfly leaned his head back with a soft little laugh, and sat watching while the Cardinal paced silently up and down the room. "Signor Rivarez," said Montanelli, stopping at last in front of him, "you have done a thing to me that a man who was born of a woman should hesitate to do to his worst enemy. You have stolen in upon my private grief, and have made for yourself a mock and jest out of the sorrow of a fellow man. I once more beg you to tell me, have I ever done you wrong? And if not, why have you played this heartless trick on me?" The Gadfly, leaning back against the chair cushions, looked up with his subtle, chilling, inscrutable smile. "It amused me, your Eminence. You took it all so much to heart, and it reminded me a little bit of a variety show." Montanelli, white to the very lips, turned away and rang the bell. "You can take back the prisoner," he said, when the guards came in. After they had gone, he sat down at the table, still trembling with unaccustomed indignation, and took up a pile of reports which had been sent in to him by the parish priests of his diocese. Presently he pushed them away, and, leaning on the table, hid his face in both hands. The Gadfly seemed to have left some terrible shadow of himself, some ghostly trail of his personality, to haunt the room. And Montanelli sat trembling and cowering, not daring to look up lest he should see the phantom presence that he knew was not there. The spectre hardly amounted to a hallucination. It was a mere fancy of overwrought nerves, but he was seized with an unutterable dread of its shadowy presence, of the wounded hand, the smiling, cruel mouth, the mysterious eyes like deep sea water. He shook off the fancy and settled to his work. All day long he had scarcely a free moment, and the thing did not trouble him. But going into his bedroom late at night, he stopped on the threshold with a sudden shock of fear. What if he should see it in a dream? He recovered himself immediately and knelt down before the crucifix to pray. But he lay awake the whole night through. End of chapter 3 of the third part. Part 3, Chapter 4 of The Gadfly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gloria Begemann, Somerville, South Carolina. The Gadfly by Ethel Lilian VOYNICH. Part 3, Chapter 4. Montanelli's anger did not make him neglectful of his promise. He protested so emphatically against the manner in which the Gadfly had been chained that the unfortunate governor, who by now was at his wits' end, knocked off all the fetters in the recklessness of despair. "How am I to know," he grumbled to the adjutant, "what his eminence will object to next? If he calls a simple pair of handcuffs cruelty, he'll be exclaiming against the window bars presently, or wanting me to feed Riveras on oysters and truffles. In my young days malefactors were malefactors, and were treated accordingly, and nobody thought a traitor any better than a thief. But it's the fashion to be seditious nowadays, and his eminence seems inclined to encourage all the scoundrels in the country." "I don't see what business he has got to interfere at all," the adjutant remarked. "He is not a legate, and he has no authority in civil and military affairs. By law—" "What is the use of talking about law? You can't expect anyone to respect laws after the Holy Father has opened the prisons and turned the whole crew of liberal scamps loose on us. It's a positive infatuation. Of course, Monsignor Montanelli will give himself airs. He was quiet enough under His Holiness, the late Pope, but he's cock of the walk now. He has jumped into favor all at once and can do as he pleases. How am I to oppose him? He may have secret authorization from the Vatican for all I know. Everything's topsy-turvy now. You can't tell from day to day what may happen next. In the good old times one knew what to be at, but nowadays—" The governor shook his head ruefully. A world in which cardinals troubled themselves over trifles of prison discipline and talked about the rights of political offenders was a world that was growing too complex for him. The Gadfly, for his part, had returned to the fortress in a state of nervous excitement bordering on hysteria. The meeting with Montanelli had strained his endurance almost to the breaking point, and his final brutality about the variety show had been uttered in sheer desperation, merely to cut short an interview which, in another 5 minutes, would have ended in tears. Called up for interrogation in the afternoon of the same day, he did nothing but go into convulsions of laughter at every question put to him. And when the governor, worried out of all patience, lost his temper and began to swear, he only laughed more immoderately than ever. The unlucky governor fumed and stormed and threatened his refractory prisoner with impossible punishments, but finally came, as James Burton had come long ago, to the conclusion that it was mere waste of breath and temper to argue with a person in so unreasonable a state of mind. The Gadfly was once more taken back to his cell, and there lay down upon the pallet, in the mood of black and hopeless depression which always succeeded to his boisterous fits. He lay till evening without moving, without even thinking. He had passed, after the vehement emotion of the morning, into a strange, half-apathetic state in which his own misery was hardly more to him than a dull and mechanical weight pressing on some wooden thing that had forgotten to be a soul. In truth, it was of little consequence how all ended. The one thing that mattered to any sentient being was to be spared unbearable pain, and whether the relief came from altered conditions or from the deadening of the power to feel was a question of no moment. Perhaps he would succeed in escaping. Perhaps they would kill him. In any case, he should never see the Padre again, and it was all vanity and vexation of spirit. One of the warders brought in supper, and the Gadfly looked up with heavy-eyed indifference. "What time is it?" 6 o'clock. "Your supper, sir." He looked with disgust at the stale, foul-smelling, half-cold mess and turned his head away. He was feeling bodily ill as well as depressed, and the sight of the food sickened him. "You will be ill if you don't eat," said the soldier hurriedly. "Take a bit of bread, anyway. It'll do you good." The man spoke with a curious earnestness of tone, lifting a piece of sodden bread from the plate and putting it down again. All the conspirator awoke in the Gadfly. He had guessed at once that there was something hidden in the bread. "You can leave it. I'll eat a bit by and by," he said carelessly. The door was open, and he knew that the sergeant could hear every word spoken between them. When the door was locked on him again, and he had satisfied himself that no one was watching at the spy hole, he took up the piece of bread and carefully crumbled it away. In the middle was the thing he had expected, a bundle of small files. It was wrapped in a bit of paper on which a few words were written. He smoothed the paper out carefully and carried it to what little light there was. The writing was crowded into so narrow a space and on such thin paper that it was very difficult to read. "The door is unlocked and there is no moon. Get the filing done as fast as possible and come by the passage between 2 and 3. We are quite ready and may not have another chance." He crushed the paper feverishly in his hand. All the preparations were ready then, and he had only to file the window bars. How lucky it was that the chains were off. He need not stop about filing them. How many bars were there? 2, 4, and each must be filed in 2 places. 8. Oh, he could manage that in the course of the night, if he made haste. How had Gemma and Martini contrived to get everything ready so quickly? Disguises, passports, hiding places. They must have worked like cart horses to do it. And it was her plan that had been adopted after all. He laughed a little to himself at his own foolishness, as if it mattered whether the plan was hers or not. Once it was a good one, and yet he could not help being glad that if it was she who had struck on the idea of his utilizing the subterranean passage instead of letting himself down by a rope ladder, as the smugglers had at first suggested. Hers was the more complex and difficult plan, but did not involve, as the other did, a risk to the life of the sentinel on duty outside the east wall. Therefore, when the 2 schemes had been laid before him, he had unhesitatingly chosen Gemma's. The arrangement was that the friendly guard, who went by the nickname of the Cricket, should seize the first opportunity of unlocking, without the knowledge of his fellows, the iron gate leading from the courtyard into the subterranean passage underneath the ramparts, and should then replace the key on its nail in the guard-room. The Gadfly, on receiving information of this, was to file through the bars of his window, tear his shirt into strips, and plait them into a rope, by means of which he could let himself down onto the broad east wall of the courtyard. Along this wall he was to creep on hands and knees while the sentinel was looking in the opposite direction, lying flat upon the masonry whenever the man turned towards him. At the southeast corner was a half-ruined turret. It was upheld, to some extent, by a thick growth of ivy, but great masses of crumbling stone had fallen inward and lay in the courtyard, heaped against the wall. From this turret he was to climb down by the ivy and the heaps of stone into the courtyard, and softly opening the unlocked gate, to make his way along the passage to a subterranean tunnel communicating with it. Centuries ago, this tunnel had formed a secret corridor between the fortress and a tower on the neighboring hill. Now it was quite disused and blocked in many places by the falling in of the rocks. No one but the smugglers knew of a certain carefully hidden hole in the mountainside which they had bored through to the tunnel. No one suspected that stores of forbidden merchandise were often kept for weeks together under the very ramparts of the fortress itself, while the customs officers were vainly searching the houses of the sullen, wrathful-eyed mountaineers. At this hole the Gadfly was to creep out onto the hillside and make his way in the dark to a lonely spot where Martini and a smuggler would be waiting for him. The one great difficulty was that opportunities to unlock the gate after the evening patrol did not occur every night, and the descent from the window could not be made in very clear weather without too great a risk of being observed by the sentinel. Now that there was really a fair chance of success, it must not be missed. He sat down and began to eat some of the bread. It at least did not disgust him like the rest of the prison food, and he must eat something to keep up his strength. He had better lie down a bit, too, and try to get a little sleep. It would not be safe to begin filing before 10 o'clock, and he would have a hard night's work. And so, after all, the Padre had been thinking of letting him escape. That was like the Padre, but he, for his part, would never consent to it. Anything rather than that. If he escaped, it should be his own doing and that of his comrades. He would have no favors from priests. How hot it was! Surely it must be going to thunder. The air was so close and oppressive. He moved restlessly on the pallet and put the bandaged right hand behind his head for a pillow, then drew it away again. How it burned and throbbed, and all the old wounds were beginning to ache with a dull, faint persistence. What was the matter with them? Oh, absurd! It was only the thundery weather. He would go to sleep and get a little rest before beginning his filing. 8 bars, and all so thick and strong. How many more were there left to file? Surely not many. He must have been filing for hours, interminable hours. Yes, of course, that was what made his arm ache, and how it ached, right through to the very bone. But it could hardly be the filing that made his side ache so, and the throbbing, burning pain in the lame leg, was that from filing? He started up. No, he had not been asleep. He had been dreaming, with open eyes, dreaming of filing, and it was all still to do. There stood the window bars, untouched, strong and firm as ever. And there was 10 striking from the clock tower in the distance. He must get to work. He looked through the spy hole, and seeing that no one was watching, took one of the files from his breast. No, there was nothing the matter with him, nothing. It was all imagination. The pain in his side was indigestion, or a chill, or some such thing. Not much wonder, after 3 weeks of this insufferable prison food and air. As for the aching and throbbing all over, it was partly nervous trouble and partly want of exercise. Yes, that was it, no doubt, want of exercise. How absurd not to have thought of that before! He would sit down a little bit, though, and let it pass before he got to work. It would be sure to go over in a minute or two. To sit still was worse than all. When he sat still, he was at its mercy, and his face grew gray with fear. No, he must get up and set to work and shake it off. It should depend upon his will to feel or not to feel, and he would not feel. He would force it back. He stood up again and spoke to himself, aloud and distinctly. "I am not ill. I have no time to be ill. I have those bars to file, and I am not going to be ill." Then he began to file. 10:15, 10:30, 11:45. He filed and filed, and every grating scrape of the iron was as though someone was filing on his body and brain. "I wonder which will be filed through first," he said to himself with a little laugh, "I or the bars?" And he set his teeth and went on filing. 11:30. He was still filing, though the hand was stiff and swollen and would hardly grasp the tool. No, he dared not stop to rest. If he once put the horrible thing down, he should never have the courage to begin again. The sentinel moved outside the door, and the butt end of his carbine scratched against the lintel. The Gadfly stopped and looked around, the file still in his lifted hand. Was he discovered? A little round pellet had been shot through the spy hole and was lying on the floor. He laid down the file and stooped to pick up the round thing. It was a bit of rolled paper. It was a long way to go down and down, with the black waves rushing about him. How they roared! Oh, yes, he was only stooping down to pick up the paper. He was a bit giddy. Many people are when they stoop. There was nothing the matter with him. Nothing. He picked it up, carried it to the light, and unfolded it steadily. Come tonight, whatever happens. The Cricket will be transferred tomorrow to another service. This is our only chance. He destroyed the paper, as he had done the former one, picked up his file again, and went back to work, dogged and mute and desperate. 1 o'clock. He had been working for 3 hours now, and 6 of the 8 bars were filed. 2 more, and then to climb. He began to recall the former occasions when these terrible attacks had come on. The last had been the one at New Year, and he shuddered as he remembered those 5 nights. But that time it had not come on so suddenly. He had never known it so sudden. He dropped the file and flung out both hands blindly, praying in his utter desperation for the first time since he had been an atheist, praying to anything, to nothing, to everything. Not tonight. Oh, let me be ill tomorrow. I will bear anything tomorrow, only not tonight. He stood still for a moment with both hands up to his temples. Then he took up the file once more and once more went back to his work. 1:30. He had begun on the last bar. His shirt sleeve was bitten to rags. There was blood on his lips and a red mist before his eyes, and the sweat poured from his forehead as he filed and filed and filed. After sunrise, Montanelli fell asleep. He was utterly worn out with the restless misery of the night and slept for a little while quietly. Then he began to dream. At first he dreamed vaguely, confusedly. Broken fragments of images and fancies followed each other, fleeting and incoherent, but all filled with the same dim sense of struggle and pain, the same shadow of indefinable dread. Presently he began to dream of sleeplessness, the old frightful, familiar dream that had been a terror to him for years, and even as he dreamed he recognized that he had been through it all before. He was wandering about in a great empty place, trying to find some quiet spot where he could lie down and sleep. Everywhere there were people walking up and down, talking, laughing, shouting, praying, ringing bells, and clashing metal instruments together. Sometimes he would get away to a little distance from the noise and would lie down, now on the grass, now on a wooden bench, now on some slab of stone. He would shut his eyes and cover them with both hands to keep out the light, and would say to himself, "Now I will get to sleep." Then the crowds would come sweeping up to him, shouting, yelling, calling him by name, begging him, wake up, quick, we want you." Again, he was in a great palace, full of gorgeous rooms, with beds and couches and low, soft lounges. It was night, and he said to himself, "Here, at last, I shall find a quiet place to sleep." But when he chose a dark room and lay down, someone came in with a lamp, flashing the merciless light into his eyes, and said, "Get up, you are wanted." He rose and wandered on, staggering and stumbling like a creature wounded to death, and he heard the clocks strike 1, and knew that half the night was gone already, the precious night that was so short. 2, 3, 4, 5. By 6 o'clock the whole town would wake up and there would be no more silence. He went into another room and would have lain down on a bed, but someone started up from the pillows crying out, "This bed is mine," and he shrank away with despair in his heart. Hour after hour struck, and still he wandered on and on, from room to room, from house to house, from corridor to corridor. The horrible gray dawn was creeping nearer and nearer. The clocks were striking 5. The night was gone, and he had found no rest. Oh, misery! Another day! Another day! He was in a long, subterranean corridor, a low, vaulted passage that seemed to have no end. It was lighted with glaring lamps and chandeliers, and through its grated roof came the sounds of dancing and laughter and merry music. Up there, in the world of the live people overhead, there was some festival, no doubt. Oh, for a place to hide and sleep, some little place, were it even a grave. And as he spoke he stumbled over an open grave smelling of death and rottenness. Ah, what matter, so he could but sleep. "This grave is mine." It was Gladys, and she raised her head and stared at him over the rotting shroud. Then he knelt down and stretched out his arms to her. "Gladys, Gladys, have a little pity on me. Let me creep into this narrow space and sleep. I do not ask you for your love. I will not touch you, will not speak to you. Only let me lie down beside you and sleep. Oh, love, it is so long since I have slept. I cannot bear another day. The light glares in upon my soul. The noise is beating my brain to dust. Gladys, let me come in here and sleep." And he would have drawn her shroud across his eyes, but she shrank away, screaming, "It is a sacrilege! You are a priest!" On and on he wandered, and came out upon the seashore, on the barren rocks where the fierce light struck down, and the water moaned its low, perpetual wail of unrest. "Ah," he said, "the sea will be more merciful. It, too, is wearied unto death and cannot sleep." Then Arthur rose up from the deep and cried aloud, "This sea is mine." "Your Eminence! Your Eminence!" Montanelli awoke with a start. His servant was knocking at the door. He rose mechanically and opened it, and the man saw how wild and scared he looked. "Your Eminence, are you ill?" He drew both hands across his forehead. "No, I was asleep, and you startled me. I am very sorry. I thought I had heard you moving early this morning, and I supposed—" "Is it late now?" "It is 9 o'clock, and the governor has called. He says he has very important business, and knowing your Eminence to be an early riser—" "Is he downstairs? I will come presently." He dressed and went downstairs. "I am afraid this is an unceremonious way to call upon your Eminence," the governor began. "I hope there is nothing the matter."
"There is very much the matter. Rivarez has all but succeeded in escaping." "Well, so long as he has not quite succeeded, there is no harm done. How was it?" "He was found in the courtyard, right against the little iron gate. When the patrol came in to inspect the courtyard at 3 o'clock this morning, one of the men stumbled over something on the ground, and when they brought the light up, they found Rivarez lying across the path unconscious. They raised an alarm at once and called me up, and when I went to examine his cell, I found all the window bars filed through and a rope made of torn body linen hanging from one of them. He had let himself down and climbed along the wall. The iron gate, which leads into the subterranean tunnels, was found to be unlocked. That looks as if the guards had been suborned." "But how did he come to be lying across the path? Did he fall from the rampart and hurt himself?" "That is what I thought at first, Your Eminence. But the prison surgeon can't find any trace of a fall. The soldier who was on duty yesterday says that Rivarez looked very ill last night when he brought in the supper and did not eat anything. But that must be nonsense. A sick man couldn't file those bars through and climb along that roof. It's not in reason." "Does he give any account of himself?" "He is unconscious, Your Eminence." "Still?" "He just half comes to himself from time to time and moans, and then goes off again." "That is very strange. What does the doctor think?" "He doesn't know what to think. There is no trace of heart disease that he can find to account for the thing. But whatever is the matter with him, it is something that must have come on suddenly, just when he had nearly managed to escape. For my part, I believe he was struck down by the direct intervention of a merciful providence." Montanelli frowned slightly. "What are you going to do with him?" he asked. "That is a question I shall settle in a very few days. In the meantime, I have had a good lesson. That is what comes of taking off the irons, with all due respect to Your Eminence." "I hope," Montanelli interrupted, "that you will at least not replace the fetters while he is ill. A man in the condition you describe can hardly make any more attempts to escape." "I shall take good care he doesn't," the governor muttered to himself as he went out. "His Eminence can go hang with his sentinel's scruples for all I care. Rivarez is chained pretty tight now, and is going to stop so, ill or not." "But how can it have happened? To faint away at the last moment, when everything was ready, when he was at the very gate. It's like some hideous joke." "I tell you," Martini answered, "the only thing I can think of is that one of these attacks must have come on, and that he must have struggled against it as long as his strength lasted, and have fainted from sheer exhaustion when he got down into the courtyard." Marconi knocked the ashes savagely from his pipe. "Well, anyhow, that's the end of it. We can't do anything for him now, poor fellow." "Poor fellow," Martini echoed under his breath. He was beginning to realize that to him, too, the world would look empty and dismal without the Gadfly. "What does she think?" the smuggler asked, glancing towards the other end of the room, where Gemma sat alone, her hands lying idly in her lap, her eyes looking straight before her into blank nothingness. "I have not asked her. She has not spoken since I brought her the news. We had best not disturb her just yet." She did not appear to be conscious of their presence, but they both spoke with lowered voices as though they were looking at a corpse. After a dreary little pause, Marconi rose and put away his pipe. "I will come back this evening," he said, but Martini stopped him with a gesture. "Don't go yet. I want to speak to you." He dropped his voice still lower and continued in almost a whisper, "Do you believe there is really no hope?" "I don't see what hope there can be now. We can't attempt it again. Even if he were well enough to manage his part of the thing, we couldn't do our share. The sentinels are all being changed, on suspicion. The cricket won't get another chance, you may be sure." "Don't you think," Martini asked suddenly, that, when he recovers, something might be done by calling off the sentinels? Calling off the sentinels? What do you mean? Well, it has occurred to me that if I were to get in the governor's way when the procession passes close by the fortress on Corpus Domini Day and fire in his face, all the sentinels would come rushing to get hold of me, and some of you fellows could perhaps help Rivarez out in the confusion. It really hardly amounts to a plan. It only came into my head. I doubt whether it could be managed, Marconi answered with a very grave face. Certainly it would want a lot of thinking out for anything to come of it. But he stopped and looked at Martini. If it should be possible, would you do it? Martini was a reserved man at ordinary times, but this was not an ordinary time. He looked straight into the smuggler's face. Would I do it? He repeated. Look at her. There was no need for further explanations. In saying that he had said all, Marconi turned and looked across the room. She had not moved since their conversation began. There was no doubt, no fear, even no grief in her face. There was nothing in it but the shadow of death. The smuggler's eyes filled with tears as he looked at her. "Make haste, Michaela," he said, throwing open the veranda door and looking out. "Aren't you nearly done, you two? There are 150 things to do." Michaela, followed by Gino, came in from the veranda. "I am ready now," he said. "I only want to ask the signora." He was moving towards her when Martini caught him by the arm. "Don't disturb her. She's better alone." "Let her be," Marconi added. "We shan't do any good by meddling. God knows, it's hard enough on all of us, but it's worse for her. Poor soul." End of chapter 4 of the third part.
Part 3, Chapter 5 of The Gadfly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Gadfly by Ethel Lilian VOYNICH. Part 3, Chapter 5. For a week the Gadfly lay in a fearful state. The attack was a violent one, and the governor, rendered brutal by fear and perplexity, had not only chained him hand and foot, but had insisted on his being bound to his pallet with leather straps, drawn so tight that he could not move without their cutting into the flesh. He endured everything with his dogged, bitter stoicism till the end of the 6th day. Then his pride broke down, and he piteously entreated the prison doctor for a dose of opium. The doctor was quite willing to give it, but the governor, hearing of the request, sharply forbade any such foolery. "How do you know what he wants it for?" he said. "It's just as likely as not that he's shamming all the time and wants to drug the sentinel or some such devilry. Rivarez is cunning enough for anything." "My giving him a dose would hardly help him to drug the sentinel," replied the doctor, unable to suppress a smile. "And as for shamming, there's not much fear of that. He is as likely as not to die. Anyway, I won't have it given. If a man wants to be tenderly treated, he should behave accordingly. He has thoroughly deserved a little sharp discipline. Perhaps it will be a lesson to him not to play tricks with the window bars again." "The law does not admit of torture, though," the doctor ventured to say, "and this is coming perilously near it." "The law says nothing about opium, I think," said the governor snappishly. "It is for you to decide, of course, Colonel, but I hope you will let the straps be taken off at any rate. They are a needless aggravation of his misery. There's no fear of his escaping now. He couldn't stand if you let him go free." "My good sir, a doctor may make a mistake like other people, I suppose. I have got him safe strapped now, and he's going to stop so." "At least, then, have the straps a little loosened. It is downright barbarity to keep them drawn so tight." "They will stop exactly as they are, and I will thank you, sir, not to talk about barbarity to me. If I do a thing, I have a reason for it." So the 7th night passed without any relief, and the soldier stationed on guard at the cell door crossed himself, shuddering, over and over again, as he listened all night long to heart-rending moans. The Gadfly's endurance was failing him at last. At 6 in the morning the sentinel, just before going off duty, unlocked the door softly and entered the cell. He knew that he was committing a serious breach of discipline, but could not bear to go away without offering the consolation of a friendly word. He found the Gadfly lying still, with closed eyes and parted lips. He stood silent for a moment, then stooped down and asked, "Can I do anything for you, sir? I have only a minute." The Gadfly opened his eyes. "Let me alone," he moaned. "Let me alone." He was asleep almost before the soldier had slipped back to his post. 10 days afterwards the governor called again at the palace, but found that the cardinal had gone to visit a sick man at Pieve d'Ottavo, and was not expected home till the afternoon. That evening, just as he was sitting down to dinner, his servant came in to announce, "His Eminence would like to speak to you." The governor, with a hasty glance into the looking-glass, to make sure that his uniform was in order, put on his most dignified air, and went into the reception-room, where Montanelli was sitting, beating his hand gently on the arm of the chair, and looking out of the window with an anxious line between his brows. "I heard that you called today," he said, cutting short the governor's polite speeches with a slightly imperious manner which he never adopted in speaking to the country folk. "It was probably on the business about which I have been wishing to speak to you." "It was about Rivera's, Your Eminence." "So I supposed. I have been thinking the matter over these last few days, but before we go into that, I should like to hear whether you have anything new to tell me." The governor pulled his moustaches with an embarrassed air. "The fact is, I came to know whether Your Eminence had anything to tell me. If you still have an objection to the course I proposed taking, I should be sincerely glad of your advice in the matter, for honestly I don't know what to do." "Is there any new difficulty?" "Only that next Thursday is the 3rd of June, Corpus Domini, and somehow or other the matter must be settled before then." "Thursday is Corpus Domini, certainly, but why must it be settled especially before then?" "I am exceedingly sorry, Your Eminence, if I seem to oppose you, but I can't undertake to be responsible for the peace of the town if Rivera's is not got rid of before then. All the roughest set in the hills collects here for that day, as Your Eminence knows, and it is more than probable that they may attempt to break open the fortress gates and take him out. They won't succeed. I'll take care of that, if I have to sweep them from the gates with powder and shot. But we are very likely to have something of that kind before the day is over. Here in the Romagna there is bad blood in the people, and when once they get out their knives, I think with a little care we can prevent matters going as far as knives. I have always found the people of this district easy to get on with, if they are reasonably treated. Of course, if you once begin to threaten or coerce a Romagnol, he becomes unmanageable. But have you any reason for supposing a new rescue scheme is intended? I heard, both this morning and yesterday, from confidential agents of mine, that a great many rumors are circulating all over the district, and that the people are evidently up to some mischief or other. But one can't find out the details. If one could, it would be easier to take precautions. And for my part, after the fright we had the other day, I prefer to be on the safe side. With such a cunning fox as Rivarez, one can't be too careful. The last I heard about Rivarez was that he was too ill to move or speak. Is he recovering, then? He seems much better now, Your Eminence. He certainly has been very ill, unless he was shamming all the time. Have you any reason for supposing that likely? Well, the doctor seems convinced that it was all genuine, but it's a very mysterious kind of illness. Anyway, he is recovering and more intractable than ever. What has he done now? There's not much he can do, fortunately, the governor answered, smiling as he remembered the straps, but his behavior is something indescribable. Yesterday morning I went into the cell to ask him a few questions. He is not well enough yet to come to me for interrogation, and indeed I thought it best not to run any risk of the people seeing him until he recovers. Such absurd stories always get about at once. So you went there to interrogate him? Yes, Your Eminence. I hoped he would be more amenable to reason now. Montanelli looked him over deliberately, almost as if he had been inspecting a new and disagreeable animal. Unfortunately, however, the governor was fingering his sword-belt and did not see the look. He went on placidly. I have not subjected him to any particular severities, but I have been obliged to be rather strict with him, especially as it is a military prison, and I thought that perhaps a little indulgence might have a good effect. I offered to relax the discipline considerably if he would behave in a reasonable manner, and how does Your Eminence suppose he answered me? He lay looking at me a minute, like a wolf in a cage, and then said quite softly, "Colonel, I can't get up and strangle you, but my teeth are pretty good. You had better take your throat a little further off." He is as savage as a wildcat. "I am not surprised to hear it," Montanelli answered quietly. "But I came to ask you a question. Do you honestly believe that the presence of Rivarez in the prison here constitutes a serious danger to the peace of the district?" "Most certainly I do, Your Eminence." "You think that, to prevent the risk of bloodshed, it is absolutely necessary that he should somehow be got rid of before Corpus Domini?" "I can only repeat that if he is here on Thursday, I do not expect the festival to pass over without a fight, and I think it likely to be a serious one." "And you think that if he were not here, there would be no such danger?" "In that case there would either be no disturbance at all, or at most a little shouting and stone-throwing. If Your Eminence can find some way of getting rid of him, I will undertake that the peace shall be kept. Otherwise, I expect most serious trouble. I am convinced that a new rescue plot is on hand, and Thursday is the day when we may expect the attempt. Now, if on that very morning they suddenly find that he is not in the fortress at all, their plan fails of itself, and they have no occasion to begin fighting. But if we have to repulse them, and the daggers once get drawn among such throngs of people, we are likely to have the place burnt down before nightfall." "Then why do you not send him into Ravenna?" "Heaven knows, Your Eminence." "I should be thankful to do it. But how am I to prevent the people rescuing him on the way? I have not soldiers enough to resist an armed attack, and all these mountaineers have got knives, or flintlocks, or some such thing." "You still persist, then, in wishing for a court-martial, and in asking my consent for it?" "Pardon me, Your Eminence. I ask you only one thing, to help me prevent riots and bloodshed. I am quite willing to admit that the military commissions, such as that of Colonel Freddy, were sometimes unnecessarily severe, and irritated instead of subduing the people. But I think that in this case a court-martial would be a wise measure, and in the long run a merciful one. It would prevent a riot, which in itself would be a terrible disaster, and which very likely might cause a return of the military commissions His Holiness has abolished. The governor finished his little speech with much solemnity, and waited for the cardinal's answer. It was a long time coming, and when it came was startlingly unexpected. "Colonel Ferrari, do you believe in God?" "Your Eminence," the colonel gasped, in a voice full of exclamation stops. "Do you believe in God?" Montanelli repeated, rising and looking down at him with steady, searching eyes. The colonel rose too. "Your Eminence, I am a Christian man, and have never yet been refused absolution." Montanelli lifted the cross from his breast. "Then swear on the cross of the Redeemer, who died for you, that you have been speaking the truth to me." The colonel stood still and gazed at it blankly. He could not quite make up his mind which was mad, he or the cardinal. "You have asked me," Montanelli went on, "to give my consent to a man's death. Kiss the cross if you dare, and tell me that you believe there is no other way to prevent greater bloodshed. And remember that if you tell me a lie, you are imperiling your immortal soul." After a little pause, the governor bent down and put the cross to his lips. "I believe it," he said. Montanelli turned slowly away. "I will give you a definite answer tomorrow. But first I must see Rivarez and speak to him alone. Your Eminence, if I might suggest, I am sure you will regret it. For that matter, he sent me a message yesterday by the guard, asking to see your Eminence, but I took no notice of it, because—" "Took no notice?" Montanelli repeated. "A man in such circumstances sent you a message, and you took no notice of it?" "I am sorry if your Eminence is displeased. I did not wish to trouble you over a mere impertinence like that. I know Rivarez well enough by now to feel sure that he only wanted to insult you, and indeed, if you will allow me to say so, it would be most imprudent to go near him alone. He is really dangerous, so much so, in fact, that I have thought it necessary to use some physical restraint of a mild kind." "And you really think there is much danger to be apprehended from one sick and unarmed man, who is under physical restraint of a mild kind?" Montanelli spoke quite gently, but the colonel felt the sting of his quiet contempt, and flushed under it resentfully. "Your Eminence will do as you think best," he said in his stiffest manner. "I only wish to spare you the pain of hearing this man's awful blasphemies. Which do you think the more grievous misfortune for a Christian man, to hear a blasphemous word uttered, or to abandon a fellow creature in extremity?" The governor stood erect and stiff, with his official face, like a face of wood. He was deeply offended at Montanelli's treatment of him, and showed it by unusual ceremoniousness. "At what time does your Eminence wish to visit the prisoner?" he asked. "I will go to him at once." "As your Eminence pleases. If you will kindly wait a few moments, I will send someone to prepare him." The governor had come down from his official pedestal in a great hurry. He did not want Montanelli to see the straps. "Thank you. I would rather see him as he is, without preparation. I will go straight up to the fortress. Good evening, Colonel. You may expect my answer tomorrow morning." End of Chapter 5 of the third part.
Part 3, Chapter 6 of The Gadfly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daria. The Gadfly by Ethel Lilian VOYNICH. Part 3, Chapter 6. Hearing the cell door unlocked, the Gadfly turned away his eyes with languid indifference. He supposed that it was only the governor, coming to worry him with another interrogation. Several soldiers mounted the narrow stair, their carbines clanking against the wall. Then a deferential voice said, "It is rather steep here, Your Eminence." He started convulsively and then shrank down, catching his breath under the stinging pressure of the straps. Montanelli came in, with the sergeant and 3 guards. "If Your Eminence will kindly wait a moment," The sergeant began nervously. "One of my men will bring a chair. He has just gone to fetch it. Your Eminence will excuse us. If we had been expecting you, we should have been prepared." "There is no need for any preparation. Will you kindly leave us alone, Sergeant, and wait at the foot of the stairs with your men?" "Yes, Your Eminence. Here is the chair. Shall I put it beside him?" The Gadfly was lying with closed eyes, but he felt that Montanelli was looking at him. "I think he is asleep, Your Eminence," the sergeant was beginning, but the Gadfly opened his eyes. "No," he said. As the soldiers were leaving the cell, they were stopped by a sudden exclamation from Montanelli, and turning back saw that he was bending down to examine the straps. "Who has been doing this?" he asked. The sergeant fumbled with his cap. "It was by the governor's express orders, Your Eminence." "I'd no idea of this, Signor Rivarez," Montanelli said in a voice of great distress. "I told Your Eminence," the Gadfly answered with his hard smile, "that I never expected to be patted on the head." "Sergeant, how long has this been going on?" "Since you tried to escape, Your Eminence." "That is nearly a week. Bring a knife and cut these off at once." "May it please Your Eminence, the doctor wanted to take them off, but Colonel Ferrari wouldn't allow it." "Bring a knife at once." Montanelli had not raised his voice, but the soldiers could see that he was white with anger. The sergeant took a clasp knife from his pocket and bent down to cut the arm strap. He was not a skillful-fingered man, and he jerked the strap tighter with an awkward movement so that the Gadfly winced and bit his lip in spite of all his self-control. Montanelli came forward at once. "You don't know how to do it. Give me the knife." "Ah!" The Gadfly stretched out his arms with a long, rapturous sigh as the strap fell off. The next instant Montanelli had cut the other one, which bound his ankles. "Take off the irons, too, Sergeant, and then come here. I want to speak to you." He stood by the window, looking on till the sergeant threw down the fetters and approached him. "Now," he said, "tell me everything that has been happening." The sergeant, nothing loath, related all that he knew of the Gadfly's illness, of the disciplinary measures, and of the doctor's unsuccessful attempt to interfere. "But I think, Your Eminence," he added, "that the colonel wanted the straps kept on as a means of getting evidence." "Evidence?" "Yes, Your Eminence. The day before yesterday I heard him offer to have them taken off if he," with a glance at the Gadfly, "would answer a question he had asked." Montanelli clenched his hand on the window-sill, and the soldiers glanced at one another. They had never seen the gentle cardinal angry before. As for the Gadfly, he had forgotten their existence. He had forgotten everything except the physical sensation of freedom. He was cramped in every limb, and now stretched and turned and twisted about in a positive ecstasy of relief. "You can go now, Sergeant," the cardinal said. "You need not feel anxious about having committed a breach of discipline. It was your duty to tell me when I asked you. See that no one disturbs us. I will come out when I am ready." When the door had closed behind the soldiers, he leaned on the window-sill and looked for a while at the sinking sun, so as to leave the Gadfly a little more breathing time. "I have heard," he said presently, leaving the window, and sitting down beside the pallet, "that you wish to speak to me alone. If you feel well enough to tell me what you wanted to say, I am at your service." He spoke very coldly, with a stiff, imperious manner that was not natural to him. Until the straps were off, the Gadfly was to him simply a grievously wronged and tortured human being. But now he recalled their last interview, and the deadly insult with which it had closed. The Gadfly looked up, resting his head lazily on one arm. He possessed the gift of slipping into graceful attitudes, and when his face was in shadow, no one would have guessed through what deep waters he had been passing. But as he looked up, the clear evening light showed how haggard and colourless he was, and how plainly the trace of the last few days was stamped on him. Montanelli's anger died away. "I am afraid you have been terribly ill," he said. "I am sincerely sorry that I did not know of all this. I would have put a stop to it before." The Gadfly shrugged his shoulders. "All's fair in war," he said coolly. "Your Eminence objects to straps theoretically, from the Christian standpoint, but it is hardly fair to expect the colonel to see that. He no doubt would prefer not to try them on his own skin, which is just my case, but that is a matter of personal convenience. At this moment I am undermost. What would you have? It is very kind of your Eminence, though, to call here. But perhaps that was done from the Christian standpoint, too. Visiting prisoners. Ah, yes, I forgot. Inasmuch as ye did it on to one of the least of these. It's not very complimentary, but one of the least is duly grateful."
Signor Rivarez, the cardinal interrupted, I have come here on your account, not on my own. If you had not been undermost, as you call it, I should never have spoken to you again after what you said to me last week. But you have the double privilege of a prisoner and a sick man, and I could not refuse to come. Have you anything to say to me, now I am here, or have you sent for me merely to amuse yourself by insulting an old man? There was no answer. The Gadfly had turned away and was lying with one hand across his eyes. I am very sorry to trouble you, he said at last huskily, but could I have a little water? There was a jug of water standing by the window, and Montanelli rose and fetched it. As he slipped his arm round the Gadfly to lift him, he suddenly felt the damp, cold fingers close over his wrist like a vice. Give me your hand, quick, just a moment, the Gadfly whispered. Oh, what difference does it make to you? Only 1 minute. He sank down, hiding his face on Montanelli's arm, and quivering from head to foot. Drink a little water, Montanelli said after a moment. The Gadfly obeyed silently, then lay back on the pallet with closed eyes. He himself could have given no explanation of what had happened to him when Montanelli's hand had touched his cheek. He only knew that in all his life there had been nothing more terrible. Montanelli drew his chair closer to the pallet and sat down. The Gadfly was lying quite motionless like a corpse, and his face was livid and drawn. After a long silence he opened his eyes and fixed their haunting spectral gaze on the cardinal. Thank you, he said. I am sorry. I think you asked me something. You are not fit to talk. If there is anything you want to say to me, I will try to come again tomorrow. Please don't go, Your Eminence. Indeed, there is nothing the matter with me. I've been a little upset these few days. It was half of it lingering, though. The Colonel will tell you so if you ask him. I prefer to form my own conclusions, Montanelli answered quietly. So does the Colonel. And occasionally, do you know, they're rather witty. You wouldn't think it to look at him, but sometimes he gets hold of an original idea. On Friday night, for instance, I think it was Friday, but I got a little mixed as to time towards the end. Anyhow, I asked for a dose of opium. I remember that quite distinctly, and he came in here and I said I might have it if I would tell him who unlocked the gate. I remember that quite distinctly, and he came in here and said I might have it if I would tell him who unlocked the gate. I remember his saying, if it's real, you'll consent. If you don't, I shall look upon it as a proof that you are shamming. It never occurred to me before how comic that is. It's one of the funniest things. He burst into a sudden fit of harsh, discordant laughter. Then, turning sharply on the silent cardinal, went on, more and more hurriedly, and stammering so that the words were hardly intelligible. You don't see that it's funny? Of course not. You religious people never have any sense of humor. You take everything tragically. For instance, that night in the cathedral, how solemn you were. By the way, what a pathetic figure I must have cut as the pilgrim. I don't believe you even see anything comic in the business you have come about this evening. Montanelli rose. I came to hear what you have to say, but I think you are too much excited to say it tonight. The doctor had better give you a sedative, and we will talk tomorrow, when you have had a night's sleep. Sleep? Oh, I shall sleep well enough, Your Eminence. When you give your consent to the Colonel's plan, an ounce of lead is a splendid sedative. I don't understand you, Montanelli said, turning to him with a startled look. The Gadfly burst out laughing again. Your Eminence, truth is the chief of the Christian virtues. Do you think I don't know how hard the governor has been trying to get your consent to a court-martial? You had been better by half give it, Your Eminence. It's only what all your brother prelates would do in your place. Così fan tutti, and then you would be doing such a lot of good and so little harm. Really, it's not worth all the sleepless nights you have been spending over it. Please stop laughing a minute, Montanelli interrupted, and tell me how you heard all this. Who has been talking to you about it? Hasn't the Colonel ever told you I'm a devil, not a man? No? He has told me so often. Well, I am devil enough to find out a little bit what people are thinking about. Your Eminence is thinking that I'm a confounded nuisance, and you wish somebody else had to settle what's to be done with me, without disturbing your sensitive conscience. That's a pretty fair guess, isn't it? Listen to me, the Cardinal said, sitting down again beside him with a very grave face. However you found out all this, it is quite true. Colonel Ferrari fears another rescue attempt on the part of your friends, and wishes to forestall it in the way you speak of. You see, I am quite frank with you. Your Eminence was always famous for truthfulness, the Gadfly put in bitterly. You know, of course, Montanelli went on, that legally I have no jurisdiction in temporal matters. I am a bishop, not a legate. But I have a good deal of influence in this district, and the colonel will not, I think, venture to take so extreme a course unless he can get, at least, my tacit consent to it. Up till now I have unconditionally opposed the scheme, and he has been trying very hard to conquer my objection by assuring me that there is great danger of an armed attempt on Thursday, when the crowd collects for the procession, an attempt which probably would end in bloodshed. Do you follow me? The Gadfly was staring absently out of the window. He looked round and answered in a weary voice, Yes, I am listening. Perhaps you are really not well enough to stand this conversation tonight. Shall I come back in the morning? It is a very serious matter, and I want your whole attention. I would rather get it over now, the Gadfly answered in the same tone. I follow everything you say. Now, if it be true, Montanelli went on, that there is any real danger of riots and bloodshed on account of you, I am taking upon myself a tremendous responsibility in opposing the colonel, and I believe there is at least some truth in what he says. On the other hand, I am inclined to think that his judgment is warped to a certain extent by his personal animosity against you, and that he probably exaggerates the danger. That seems to be the more likely, since I have seen this shameful brutality. He glanced at the straps and chains lying on the floor, and went on, If I consent, I kill you. If I refuse, I run the risk of killing innocent persons. I have considered the matter earnestly, and have sought with all my heart for a way out of this dreadful alternative. And now at last I have made up my mind. To kill me and save the innocent persons, of course. The only decision a Christian man could possibly come to. If thy right hand offend thee, etc. I have not the honor to be the right hand of your Eminence, and I have offended you. The conclusion is plain. Couldn't you tell me that without so much preamble? The Gadfly spoke with languid indifference and contempt, like a man weary of the whole subject. Well, he added after a little pause, was that the decision, your Eminence? No. The Gadfly shifted his position, putting both hands behind his head, and looked at Montanelli with half-shut eyes. The Cardinal, with his head sunk down as in deep thought, was softly beating one hand on the arm of his chair. Ah, that old familiar gesture. I have decided, he said, raising his head at last, to do, I suppose, an utterly unprecedented thing. When I heard that you had asked to see me, I resolved to come here and tell you everything, as I have done, and to place the matter in your own hands. In my hands? Signor Rivarez, I have not come to you as cardinal, or as bishop, or as judge. I have come to you as one man to another. I do not ask you to tell me whether you know of any such scheme as the colonel apprehends. I understand quite well that if you do, it is your secret, and you will not tell it. But I do ask you to put yourself in my place. I am old, and, no doubt, have not much longer to live. I would go down to my grave without blood on my hands. Is there none on them as yet, your Eminence? Montanelli grew a shade paler, but went on quietly. All my life I have opposed repressive measures and cruelty wherever I have met with them. I have always disapproved of capital punishment in all its forms. I have protested earnestly and repeatedly against the military commissions in the last reign, and have been out of favor on account of doing so. Up till now, such influence and power as I have possessed have always been employed on the side of mercy. I ask you to believe me, at least, that I am speaking the truth. Now I am placed in this dilemma. By refusing, I am exposing the town to the danger of riots and all their consequences, and this to save the life of a man who blasphemes against my religion, who has slandered and wronged and insulted me personally, though that is comparatively a trifle, and who, as I firmly believe, will put that life to a bad use when it is given to him. But it is to save a man's life. He paused a moment and went on again. Signor Rivarez, everything that I know of your career seems to me bad and mischievous, and I have long believed you to be reckless and violent and unscrupulous. To some extent I hold that opinion of you still. But during this last fortnight you have shown me that you are a brave man and that you can be faithful to your friends. You have made the soldiers love and admire you too, and not every man could have done that. I think that perhaps I have misjudged you, and that there is in you something better than what you show outside. To that better self in you I appeal, and solemnly entreat you on your conscience to tell me truthfully, in my place, what would you do?" A long silence followed. Then the Gadfly looked up. "At least I would decide my own actions for myself, and take the consequences of them. I would not come sneaking to other people in the cowardly Christian way, asking them to solve my problems for me." The onslaught was so sudden, and its extraordinary vehemence and passion were in such startling contrast to the languid affectation of a moment before, that it was as though he had thrown off a mask. "We atheists," he went on fiercely, "understand that if a man has a thing to bear, he must bear it as best he can. If he sinks under it, why, so much the worse for him. But a Christian comes whining to his God or his saints, or if they won't help him, to his enemies. He can always find a back to shift his burdens onto. Isn't there a rule to go by in your Bible or your Missal or any of your canning theology books that you must come to me to tell you what to do? Heavens and earth, man! Haven't I enough as it is, without you are laying your responsibilities on my shoulders? Go back to your Jesus. He exacted the uttermost farthing, and you'd better do the same. After all, you'll only be killing an atheist, a man who boggles over shibboleth, and that's no great crime, surely." He broke off, panting for breath, and then burst out again. "And you to talk of cruelty! Why, that pudding-headed ass couldn't hurt me as much as you do if he tried for a year. He hasn't got the brains. All he can think of is to pull a strap tight, and when he can't get it any tighter, he's at the end of his resources. Any fool can do that, but you? Sign your own death sentence, please. I'm too tender-hearted to do it myself. Oh, it would take a Christian to hit on that. A gentle, compassionate Christian that turns pale at the sight of a strap pulled too tight. I might have known when you came in, like an angel of mercy, so shocked at the Colonel's barbarity that the real thing was going to begin. Why do you look at me that way? Consent, man, of course, and go home to your dinner. The thing's not worth all this fuss. Tell your Colonel he can have me shot or hanged, or whatever comes handiest. Roasted alive if it's any amusement to him, and be done with it." The Gadfly was hardly recognizable. He was beside himself with rage and desperation, panting and quivering, his eyes glittering with green reflections like the eyes of an angry cat. Montanelli had risen and was looking down at him silently. He did not understand the drift of the frenzied reproaches, but he understood out of what extremity they were uttered, and understanding that, forgave all past insults. "Hush," he said. "I did not want to hurt you so. Indeed, I never meant to shift my burden onto you, who have too much already. I have never consciously done that to any living creature." "It's a lie!" the Gadfly cried out with blazing eyes. "And the bishopric?" "The bishopric? Ah, you've forgotten that. It's so easy to forget. If you wish it, Arthur, I will say I cannot go. I was to decide your life for you. I, at 19. If it weren't so hideous, it would be funny." "Stop!" Montanelli put up both hands to his head with a desperate cry. He let them fall again and walked slowly away to the window. There he sat down on the sill, resting one arm on the bars and pressing his forehead against it. The Gadfly lay and watched him, trembling. Presently Montanelli rose and came back, with lips as pale as ashes. "I am very sorry," he said, struggling piteously to keep up his usual quiet manner. "But I must go home. I am not quite well." He was shivering as if with ague. All the Gadfly's fury broke down. "Padre, can't you see?" Montanelli shrank away and stood still. "Only not that," he whispered at last. "My God, anything but that. If I am going mad—" The Gadfly raised himself on one arm and took the shaking hands in his. "Padre, will you never understand that I am not really drowned?" The hands grew suddenly cold and stiff. For a moment everything was dead with silence, and then Montanelli knelt down and hid his face on the Gadfly's breast. When he raised his head the sun had set, and the red glow was dying in the west. They had forgotten time and place, and life and death. They had forgotten even that they were enemies. "Arthur," Montanelli whispered, "are you real? Have you come back to me from the dead?" "From the dead," the Gadfly repeated, shivering. He was lying with his head on Montanelli's arm, as a sick child might lie in its mother's embrace. "You have come back. You have come back at last." The Gadfly sighed heavily. "Yes," he said, "and you have to fight me, or to kill me." "Oh, hush, carino, what is all that now? We have been like two children lost in the dark, mistaking one another for phantoms. Now we have found each other, and have come out into the light. My poor boy, how changed you are. How changed you are! You look as if all the ocean of the world's misery had passed over your head. You that used to be so full of the joy of life. Arthur, is it really you? I have dreamed so often that you had come back to me, and then have waked and seen the outer darkness staring in upon an empty place. How can I know I shall not wake again and find it all a dream? Give me something tangible. Tell me how it all happened." "It happened simply enough. I hit on a goods vessel, a stowaway, and got out to South America. And there I lived, if you like to call it so, till... Oh, I have seen something else besides theological seminaries since you used to teach me philosophy. You say you have dreamed of me. Yes, and much. You say you have dreamed of me. Yes, and I of you." He broke off, shuddering. "Once," he began again abruptly, "I was working at a mine in Ecuador. Not as a miner. No, as a miner's fag, odd jobbing with the coolies. We had a barrack to sleep in at the pit's mouth, and one night I had been ill, the same as lately, and carrying stones in the blazing sun. I must have got light-headed, for I saw you come in at the doorway. You were holding a crucifix like that one on the wall. You were praying and brushed past me without turning. I cried out to you to help me, to give me poison or a knife, something to put an end to it all before I went mad, and you... Ah!" He drew one hand across his eyes. Montanelli was still clasping the other. "I saw in your face that you had heard, but you never looked round. You went on with your prayers. When you had finished and kissed the crucifix, you glanced round and whispered, 'I am very sorry for you, Arthur, but I daren't show it. He would be angry.' And I looked at him, and the wooden image was laughing. Then when I came to my senses and saw the barrack and the coolies with their leprosy, I understood. I saw that you care more to curry favor with that devilish god of yours than to save me from any hell. And I have remembered that. I forgot just now when you touched me. I have been ill, and I used to love you once. But there can be nothing between us but war, and war, and war. What do you want to hold my hand for? Can't you see that while you believe in your Jesus we can't be anything but enemies?" Montanelli bent his head and kissed the mutilated hand. "Arthur, how can I help believing in him? If I have kept my faith through all these frightful years, how can I ever doubt him any more, now that he has given you back to me? Remember, I thought I had killed you. You have that still to do." "Arthur!" It was a cry of actual terror, but the Gadfly went on unheeding. "Let us be honest, whatever we do, and not shilly-shally. You and I stand on two sides of a pit, and it's hopeless trying to join hands across it. If you have decided that you can't or won't give up that thing," he glanced again at the crucifix on the wall, "you must consent to what the Colonel... Consent! My God! Consent! Arthur, but I love you!" The Gadfly's face contracted fearfully. "Which do you love best, me or that thing?" Montanelli slowly rose. The very soul in him withered with dread, and he seemed to shrivel up bodily, and to grow feeble and old and wilted like a leaf that the frost had touched. He had awaked out of his dream, and the outer darkness was staring in upon an empty place. "Arthur, have just a little mercy on me." "How much had you for me when your lies drove me out to be slave to the blacks on the sugar plantations? You shudder at that? Ah, these tender-hearted saints! This is the man after God's own heart, the man that repents of his sin and lives. No one dies but his son. You say you love me. Your love has cost me dear enough. Do you think I can blot out everything, and turn back into Arthur at a few soft words? I, that have been dishwasher in filthy half-caste brothels and stable-boy to Creole farmers that were worse brutes than their own cattle. I, that have been zany in cap and bells for a strolling variety show, drudge and jack-of-all-trades to the matadors in the bullfighting ring. I, that have been slave to every black beast who cared to set his foot on my neck. I, that have been starved and spat upon and trampled underfoot. I, that have begged for mouldy scraps and been refused because the dogs had the first right. Oh, what is the use of all this? How can I tell you what you have brought on me? And now, you love me. How much do you love me? Enough to give up your God for me? Oh, what has he done for you, this everlasting Jesus? What has he suffered for you that you should love him more than me? Is it for the pierced hands he is so dear to you? Look at mine. Look here, and here, and here. He tore open his shirt and showed the ghastly scars. Padre, this God of yours is an impostor. His wounds are sham wounds. His pain is all a farce. It is I that have the right to your heart. Padre, there is no torture you have not put me to. If you could only know what my life has been. And yet I would not die. I have endured it all, and have possessed my soul in patience because I would come back and fight this God of yours. I have held this purpose as a shield against my heart, and it has saved me from madness and from the second death. And now when I come back, I find him still in my place, this sham victim that was crucified for 6 hours, forsooth, and rose again from the dead. Padre, I have been crucified for 5 years, and I, too, have risen from the dead. What are you going to do with me? What are you going to do with me? He broke down. Montanelli sat like some stone image, or like a dead man set upright. At first, upon the fiery torrent of the Gadfly's despair, he had quivered a little, with the automatic shrinking of the flesh, as under the lash of a whip, but now he was quite still. After a long silence he looked up and spoke, lifelessly, patiently. Arthur, will you explain to me more clearly? You confuse and terrify me so, I can't understand. What is it you demand of me? The Gadfly turned to him a spectral face. I demand nothing. Who shall compel love? You are free to choose between us two the one who is most dear to you. If you love him best, choose him. I can't understand, Montanelli repeated wearily. What is there I can choose? I cannot undo the past. You have to choose between us. If you love me, take that cross off your neck and come away with me. My friends are arranging another attempt, and with your help they could manage it easily. Then when we are safe over the frontier, acknowledge me publicly. But if you don't love me enough for that, if this wooden idol is more to you than I, then go to the colonel and tell him you consent. And if you go, then go at once and spare me the misery of seeing you. I have enough without that. Montanelli looked up, trembling faintly. He was beginning to understand. I will communicate with your friends, of course, but to go with you, it is impossible. I am a priest. And I accept no favors from priests. I will have no more compromises, Padre. I have had enough of them and of their consequences. You must give up your priesthood, or you must give up me. How can I give you up? Arthur, how can I give you up? Then give up him. You have to choose between us. Would you offer me a share of your love? Half for me, half for your fiend of a god? I will not take his leavings. If you are his, you are not mine. Would you have me tear my heart in two? Arthur, Arthur, do you want to drive me mad? The Gadfly struck his hand against the wall. You have to choose between us, he repeated once more. Montanelli drew from his breast a little case containing a bit of soiled and crumpled paper. Look, he said. I believed in you, as I believed in God. God is a thing made of clay that I can smash with a hammer, and you have fooled me with a lie. The Gadfly laughed and handed it back. How delightfully young one is at 19. To take a hammer and smash things seems so easy. It's that now, only it's I that am under the hammer. As for you, there are plenty of other people you can fool with lies, and they won't even find you out. As you will, Montanelli said. Perhaps in your place I should be as merciless as you. God knows. I can't do what you ask, Arthur, but I will do what I can. I will arrange your escape, and when you are safe I will have an accident in the mountains, or take the wrong sleeping draught by mistake, whatever you like to choose. Will that content you? It's all I can do. It is a great sin, but I think he will forgive me. He is more merciful. The Gadfly flung out both hands with a sharp cry. Oh, that is too much! That is too much! What have I done that you should think of me that way? What right have you? As if I wanted to be revenged on you. Can't you see that I only want to save you? Will you never understand that I love you? He caught hold of Montanelli's hands and covered them with burning kisses and tears. Padre, come away with us. What have you to do with this dead world of priests and idols? They are full of the dust of bygone ages. They are rotten. They are pestilent and foul. Come out of this plague-stricken church. Come away with us into the light. Padre, it is we that are life and youth. It is we that are the everlasting springtime. It is we that are the future. Padre, the dawn is close upon us. Will you miss your part in the sunrise? Wake up and let us forget the horrible nightmares. Wake up and we will begin our life again. Padre, I have always loved you. Always, even when you killed me. Will you kill me again? Montanelli tore his hands away. Oh, God, have mercy on me, he cried out. You have your mother's eyes. A strange silence, long and deep and sudden, fell upon them both. In the grey twilight they looked at each other, and their hearts stood still with fear. Have you anything more to say? Montanelli whispered. Any hope to give me? No. My life is of no use to me except to fight priests. I am not a man. I am a knife. If you let me live, you sanction knives. Montanelli turned to the crucifix. God, listen to this. His voice died away into the empty stillness without response. Only the mocking devil awoke again in the Gadfly. Call him louder. Perchance he sleepeth. Montanelli started up as if he had been struck. For a moment he stood looking straight before him. Then he sat down on the edge of the pallet, covered his face with both hands, and burst into tears. A long shudder passed through the Gadfly, and the damp cold broke out on his body. He knew what the tears meant. He drew the blanket over his head that he might not hear. It was enough that he had to die, he who was so vividly, magnificently alive. But he could not shut out the sound. It rang in his ears, it beat in his brain, it throbbed in all his pulses, and still Montanelli sobbed, and the tears dripped down between his fingers. He left off sobbing at last, and dried his eyes with his handkerchief, like a child that has been crying. As he stood up, the handkerchief slipped from his knee and fell to the floor. There is no use in talking any more, he said. You understand? I understand, the Gadfly answered with dull submission. It's not your fault. Your God is hungry and must be fed. Montanelli turned towards him. The grave that was to be dug was not more still than they were. Silent, they looked into each other's eyes, as two lovers, torn apart, might gaze across the barrier they cannot pass. It was the Gadfly whose eyes sank first. He shrank down, hiding his face, and Montanelli understood that the gesture meant go. He turned and went out of the cell. A moment later the Gadfly started up. Oh, I can't bear it! Padre, come back! Come back! The door was shut. He looked around him slowly with a wide, still gaze, and understood that all was over. The Galilean had conquered. All night long the grass waved slowly in the courtyard below, the grass that was so soon to wither, uprooted by the spade, and all night long the Gadfly lay alone in the darkness and sobbed. End of Chapter 6 of the third part. Recording by Daria.
Part 3, Chapter 7 of The Gadfly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Gadfly by Ethel Lilian VOYNICH. Part 3, Chapter 7. The court-martial was held on Tuesday morning. It was a very short and simple affair, a mere formality, occupying barely 20 minutes. There was, indeed, nothing to spend much time over. No defense was allowed, and the only witnesses were the wounded spy and officer and a few soldiers. The sentence was drawn up beforehand. Montanelli had sent in the desired informal consent, and the judges, Colonel Ferrari, the local major of dragoons, and 2 officers of the Swiss Guards, had little to do. The indictment was read aloud. The witnesses gave their evidence, and the signatures were affixed to the sentence, which was then read to the condemned man with befitting solemnity. He listened in silence, and when asked, according to the usual form, whether he had anything to say, merely waved the question aside with an impatient movement of his hand. Hidden on his breast was the handkerchief which Montanelli had let fall. It had been kissed and wept over all night, as though it were a living thing. Now he looked wan and spiritless, and the traces of tears were still about his eyelids. But the words, "to be shot," did not seem to affect him much. When they were uttered, the pupils of his eyes dilated, but that was all. "Take him back to his cell," the governor said, when all the formalities were over, and the sergeant, who was evidently near to breaking down, touched the motionless figure on the shoulder. The Gadfly looked round him with a little start. "Ah, yes," he said, "I forgot." There was something almost like pity in the governor's face. He was not a cruel man by nature, and was secretly a little ashamed of the part he had been playing during the last month. Now that his main point was gained, he was willing to make every little concession in his power. "You needn't put the irons on again," he said, glancing at the bruised and swollen wrists, "and he can stay in his own cell. The condemned cell is wretchedly dark and gloomy," he added, turning to his nephew, "and really the thing's a mere formality." He coughed and shifted his feet in evident embarrassment, then called back the sergeant, who was leaving the room with his prisoner. "Wait, sergeant, I want to speak to him." The Gadfly did not move, and the governor's voice seemed to fall on unresponsive ears. "If you have any message you would like conveyed to your friends or relatives—" "You have relatives, I suppose?" There was no answer. "Well, think it over and tell me, or the priest. I will see it is not neglected. You had better give your messages to the priest. He shall come at once, and stay the night with you. If there is any other wish—" The Gadfly looked up. "Tell the priest I would rather be alone. I have no friends, and no messages." "But you will want to confess." "I am an atheist. I want nothing but to be left in peace." He said it in a dull, quiet voice, without defiance or irritation, and turned slowly away. At the door he stopped again. "I forgot, Colonel. There is a favor I wanted to ask. Don't let them tie me or bandage my eyes tomorrow, please. I will stand quite still." At sunrise on Wednesday morning, they brought him out into the courtyard. His lameness was more than usually apparent, and he walked with evident difficulty and pain, leaning heavily on the sergeant's arm. But all the weary submission had gone out of his face. The spectral terrors that had crushed him down in the empty silence, the visions and dreams of the world of shadows, were gone with the night which gave them birth. And once the sun was shining and his enemies were present to rouse the fighting spirit in him, he was not afraid. The 6 carabineers who had been told off for the execution were drawn up in line against the ivied wall, the same crannied and crumbling wall down which he had climbed on the night of his unlucky attempt. They could hardly refrain from weeping as they stood together, each man with his carbine in his hand. It seemed to them a horror beyond imagination that they should be called out to kill the Gadfly. He and his stinging repartees, his perpetual laughter, his bright, infectious courage, had come into their dull and dreary lives like a wandering sunbeam, and that he should die, and at their hands, was to them as the darkening of the clear lamps of heaven. Under the great fig tree in the courtyard, his grave was waiting for him. It had been dug in the night by unwilling hands, and tears had fallen on the spade. As he passed, he looked down, smiling, at the black pit and the withering grass beside it, and drew a long breath to smell the scent of the freshly turned earth. Near the tree, the sergeant stopped short, and the Gadfly looked round with his brightest smile. "Shall I stand here, Sergeant?" The man nodded silently. There was a lump in his throat, and he could not have spoken to save his life. The governor, his nephew, the lieutenant of the Carabineers, who was ready to command, a doctor and a priest were already in the courtyard, and came forward with grave faces, half abashed under the radiant defiance of the Gadfly's laughing eyes. Good morning, gentlemen. Ah, and his reverence is up so early, too. How do you do, Captain? This is a pleasanter occasion for you than our former meeting, isn't it? I see your arm is still in a sling. That's because I bungled my work. These good fellows will do theirs better, won't you, lads?" He glanced round at the gloomy faces of the Carabineers. "There'll be no need of slings this time, anyway. There, you needn't look so doleful over it. Put your heels together and show how straight you can shoot. Before long, there'll be more work cut out for you than you'll know how to get through, and there's nothing like practice beforehand." "My son," the priest interrupted, coming forward, while the others drew back to leave them alone together. "In a few minutes you must enter into the presence of your Maker. Have you no other use but this for these last moments that are left for you for repentance? Think, I entreat you, how dreadful a thing it is to die without absolution, with all your sins upon your head. When you stand before your judge, it will be too late to repent. Will you approach his awful throne with a jest upon your lips?" "A jest, your reverence? It is your side that needs a little homily, I think. When our turn comes, we shall use field guns instead of half a dozen second-hand carbines, and then you'll see how much we're in jest." "You will use field guns? Oh, unhappy man! Have you still not realized on what frightful brink you stand?" The Gadfly glanced back over his shoulder at the open grave. "And so your reverence thinks that, when you have put me down there, you will have done with me? Perhaps you will lay a stone on the top to prevent a resurrection after 3 days? No fear, your reverence. I shan't poach on the monopoly in cheap theatricals. I shall lie as still as a mouse just where you put me. And all the same, we shall use field guns." "Oh, merciful God!" the priest cried out. "Forgive this wretched man." "Amen," murmured the lieutenant of Carabineers in a deep bass growl, while the colonel and his nephew crossed themselves devoutly. As there was evidently no hope of further insistence producing any effect, the priest gave up the fruitless attempt, and moved aside, shaking his head and murmuring a prayer. The short and simple preparations were made without more delay, and the Gadfly placed himself in the required position, only turning his head to glance up for a moment at the red and yellow splendor of the sunrise. He had repeated the request that his eyes might not be bandaged, and his defiant face had wrung from the colonel a reluctant consent. They had both forgotten what they were inflicting on the soldiers. He stood and faced them, smiling, and the carbines shook in their hands. "I am quite ready," he said. The lieutenant stepped forward, trembling a little with excitement. He had never given the word of command for an execution before. "Ready? Present. Fire!" The Gadfly staggered a little and recovered his balance. One unsteady shot had grazed his cheek, and a little blood fell onto the white cravat. Another ball had struck him above the knee. When the smoke cleared away, the soldiers looked and saw him smiling still, and wiping the blood from his cheek with the mutilated hand. "A bad shot, men," he said, and his voice cut in, clear and articulate, upon the dazed stupor of the wretched soldiers. "Have another try." A general groan and shudder passed through the row of carabineers. Each man had aimed aside, with a secret hope that the death shot would come from his neighbor's hand, not his. And there the Gadflies stood and smiled at them. They had only turned the execution into a butchery, and the whole ghastly business was to do again. They were seized with sudden terror, and, lowering their carbines, listened hopelessly to the furious curses and reproaches of the officers, staring in dull horror at the man whom they had killed and who somehow was not dead. The governor shook his fist in their faces, savagely shouting to them to stand in position, to present arms, to make haste and get the thing over. He had become as thoroughly demoralized as they were, and dared not to look at the terrible figure that stood and would not fall. When the Gadfly spoke to him, he started and shuddered at the sound of the mocking voice. "You have brought out the awkward squad this morning, Colonel. Let me see if I can manage them better. Now, men, hold your tool higher there, you to the left. Bless your heart, man, it's a carbine you've got in your hand, not a frying pan. Are you all straight? Now then, ready. Present." "Fire!" the colonel interrupted, starting forward. It was intolerable that this man should give the command for his own death. There was another confused, disorganized volley, and the line broke up into a knot of shivering figures, staring before them with wild eyes. One of the soldiers had not even discharged his carbine. He had flung it away and crouched down, moaning under his breath, "I can't! I can't!" The smoke cleared slowly away, floating up into the glimmer of the early sunlight, and they saw that the Gadfly had fallen, and saw, too, that he was still not dead. For the first moment soldiers and officials stood as if they had been turned to stone, and watched the ghastly thing that writhed and struggled on the ground. Then both doctor and colonel rushed forward with a cry, for he had dragged himself up on one knee and was still facing the soldiers and still laughing. "Another miss! Try again, lads! See if you can't—" He suddenly swayed and fell over sideways on the grass. "Is he dead?" the colonel asked under his breath, and the doctor, kneeling down with a hand on the bloody shirt, answered softly, "I think so. God be praised." "God be praised," the colonel repeated, at last. His nephew was touching him on the arm. "Uncle, it's the cardinal. He's at the gate, and wants to come in." "What? He can't come in. I won't have it." "What are the guards about?" "Your Eminence." The gate had opened and shut, and Montanelli was standing in the courtyard, looking before him with still and awful eyes. "Your Eminence, I must beg of you, this is not a fit sight for you. The execution is only just over. The body is not yet—" "I have come to look at him," Montanelli said. Even at the moment it struck the governor that his voice and bearing were those of a sleep-walker. "Oh, my God!" one of the soldiers cried out suddenly, and the governor glanced hastily back. Surely— The blood-stained heap on the grass had once more begun to struggle and moan. The doctor flung himself down and lifted the head upon his knee. "Make haste!" he cried in desperation. "You savages, make haste! Get it over, for God's sake! There's no bearing this!" Great jets of blood poured over his hands, and the convulsions of the figure that he held in his arms shook him, too, from head to foot. As he looked frantically round for help, the priest bent over his shoulder and put a crucifix to the lips of the dying man. "In the name of the Father and of the Son." The Gadfly raised himself against the doctor's knee, and with wide open eyes looked straight upon the crucifix. Slowly, amid hushed and frozen stillness, he lifted the broken right hand and pushed away the image. There was a red smear across its face. "Padre, is your God satisfied?" His head fell back on the doctor's arm. "Your Eminence!" As the Cardinal did not awake from his stupor, Colonel Ferrari repeated louder, "Your Eminence!" Montanelli looked up. "He is dead." "Quite dead, Your Eminence. Will you not come away? This is a horrible sight." "He is dead," Montanelli repeated, and looked down again at the face. "I touched him, and he is dead." "What does he expect a man to be with half a dozen bullets in him?" the lieutenant whispered contemptuously. And the doctor whispered back, "I think the sight of the blood has upset him." The governor put his hand firmly on Montanelli's arm. "Your Eminence, you had better not look at him any longer. Will you allow the chaplain to escort you home?" "Yes, I will go." He turned slowly from the blood-stained spot and walked away, the priest and sergeant following. At the gate he paused and looked back with a ghost-like still surprise. "He is dead." A few hours later, Marcona went up to a cottage on the hillside to tell Martini that there was no longer any need for him to throw away his life. All the preparations for a second attempt at rescue were ready, as the plot was much more simple than the former one. It had been arranged that on the following morning, as the Corpus Domini procession passed along the fortress hill, Martini should step forward out of the crowd, draw a pistol from his breast, and fire in the governor's face. In the moment of wild confusion which would follow, 20 armed men were to make a sudden rush at the gate, break into the tower, and, taking the turnkey with them by force, to enter the prisoner's cell and carry him bodily away, killing or overpowering everyone who interfered with them. From the gate they were to retire fighting, and cover the retreat of a second band of armed and mounted smugglers, who would carry him off into a safe hiding-place in the hills. The only person in the little group who knew nothing of the plan was Gemma. It had been kept from her at Martini's special desire. "She will break her heart over it soon enough," he had said. As the smuggler came in at the garden gate, Martini opened the glass door and stepped out onto the veranda to meet him. "Any news, Marconi?" "Ah." The smuggler had pushed back his broad-brimmed straw hat. They sat down together on the veranda. Not a word was spoken on either side. From the instant when Martini had caught sight of the face under the hat-brim, he had understood. "When was it?" he asked after a long pause, and his own voice, in his ears, was as dull and wearisome as everything else. "This morning, at sunrise. The sergeant told me. He was there and saw it." Martini looked down and flicked a stray thread from his coat sleeve. "Vanity of vanities. This also is vanity. He was to have died tomorrow, and now the land of his heart's desire had vanished, like the fairyland of golden sunset dreams that fades away when the darkness comes. And he was driven back into the world of every day and every night, the world of Grassini and Galli, of ciphering and pamphleteering, of party squabbles between comrades, and dreary intrigues among Austrian spies, of the old revolutionary mill-round that maketh the heart sick. And somewhere down at the bottom of his consciousness there was a great empty place, a place that nothing and no one would fill any more, now that the Gadfly was dead. Someone was asking him a question, and he raised his head, wondering what could be left that was worth the trouble of talking about. "What did you say?" "I was saying that of course you will break the news to her." Life, and all the horror of life, came back into Martini's face. "How can I tell her?" he cried out. "You might as well ask me to go and stab her. Oh, how can I tell her? How can I?" He had clasped both hands over his eyes, but without seeing he felt the smuggler start beside him, and looked up. Gemma was standing in the doorway. "Have you heard, Cesar?" she said. "It is all over. They have shot him." End of chapter 7 of the 3rd part. Part 3, Chapter 8 of The Gadfly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Gadfly by Ethel Lilian VOYNICH. Part 3, Chapter 8. Introibo ad altare Dei. Montanelli stood before the high altar among his ministers and acolytes, and read the introit aloud in steady tones. All the cathedral was a blaze of light and color, from the holiday dresses of the congregation to the pillars with their flaming draperies and wreaths of flowers. There was no dull spot in it. Over the open spaces of the doorway fell great scarlet curtains, through whose folds the hot June sunlight glowed as though the petals of red poppies in a cornfield. The religious orders with their candles and torches, the companies of the parishes with their crosses and flags, lighted up the dim side chapels, and in the aisles the silken folds of the processional banners drooped, their gilded staves and tassels glinting under the arches. The surplices of the choristers gleamed, rainbow-tinted, beneath the colored windows. The sunlight lay on the chancel floor in checkered stains of orange and purple and green. Behind the altar hung a shimmering veil of silver tissue, and against the veil and the decorations and the altar lights, the cardinal's figure stood out in its trailing white robes like a marble statue that had come to life. As was customary on processional days, he was only to preside at the Mass, not to celebrate, so at the end of the Indulgentiam he turned from the altar and walked slowly to the episcopal throne, celebrant and ministers bowing low as he passed. "I'm afraid His Eminence is not well," one of the canons whispered to his neighbor. "He seems so strange." Montanelli bent his head to receive the jeweled mitre. The priest who was acting as deacon of honor put it on, looked at him for an instant, then leaned forward and whispered softly, "Your Eminence, are you ill?" Montanelli turned slightly towards him. There was no recognition in his eyes. "Pardon, Your Eminence," the priest whispered, as he made a genuflection and went back to his place, reproaching himself for having interrupted the cardinal's devotions. The familiar ceremony went on, and Montanelli sat erect and still, his glittering mitre and gold-brocaded vestments flashing back the sunlight, and the heavy folds of his white festival mantle sweeping down over the red carpet. The light of 100 candles sparkled among the sapphires on his breast and shone into the deep, still eyes that had no answering gleam. And when, at the words, "Benedicite, Pater Eminentissime," he stooped to bless the incense, and the sunbeams played among the diamonds, he might have recalled some splendid and fearful ice spirit of the mountains, crowned with rainbows and robed in drifted snow, scattering with extended hands a shower of blessings or of curses. At the elevation of the host he descended from his throne and knelt before the altar. There was a strange, still evenness about all his movements, and as he rose and went back to his place, the major of dragoons, who was sitting in a gala uniform behind the governor, whispered to the wounded captain, "The old cardinal's breaking, not a doubt of it. He goes through his work like a machine." "So much the better," the captain whispered back. "He's been nothing but a millstone round all our necks ever since that confounded amnesty." "He did give in, though, about the court-martial." "Yes, at last, but he was a precious time making up his mind to. Heavens, how close it is! We shall all get sunstroke in the procession. It's a pity we're not cardinals, to have a canopy held over our heads all the way. Shh, shh! There's my uncle looking at us." Colonel Ferrari had turned round to glance severely at the two younger officers. After the solemn event of yesterday morning, He was in a devout and serious frame of mind, and inclined to reproach them with a want of proper feeling about what he regarded as a painful necessity of state. The masters of the ceremonies began to assemble and place in order those who were to take part in the procession. Colonel Ferrari rose from his place and moved up to the chancel rail, beckoning to the other officers to accompany him. When the mass was finished, and the host had been placed behind the crystal shield in the processional sun, the celebrant and his ministers retired to the sacristy to change their vestments, and a little buzz of whispered conversation broke out through the church. Montanelli remained seated on his throne, looking straight before him, immovably. All the sea of human life and motion seemed to surge around and below him, and to die away into stillness about his feet. A censer was brought to him, and he raised his hand with the action of an automaton, and put the incense into the vessel, looking neither to the right nor to the left. The clergy had come back from the sacristy, and were waiting in the chancel for him to descend, but he remained utterly motionless. The deacon of honor, bending forward to take off the mitre, whispered again, hesitatingly, "Your Eminence." The cardinal looked round. "What did you say? Are you quite sure the procession will not be too much for you? The sun is very hot." "What does the sun matter?" Montanelli spoke in a cold, measured voice, and the priest again fancied that he must have given offence. "Forgive me, Your Eminence. I thought you seemed unwell." Montanelli rose without answering. He paused a moment on the upper step of the throne, and asked in the same measured way, "What is that?" The long train of his mantle swept down over the steps and lay spread out on the chancel floor, and he was pointing to a fiery stain on the white satin. "It's only the sunlight shining through a colored window, Your Eminence." "The sunlight? Is it so red?" He descended the steps and knelt before the altar, swinging the censer slowly to and fro. As he handed it back, the checkered sunlight fell on his bared head and wide uplifted eyes, and cast a crimson glow across the white veil that his ministers were folding round him. He took from the deacon the sacred golden sun, and stood up as choir and organ burst into a peal of triumphal melody. Pange lingua gloriosi, corporis mysterium, sanguinisque pretiosi, cam in mundi pretium, fructus ventris generosi, rex effuvit gentium. The bearers came slowly forward, and raised the silken canopy over his head, while the deacons of honor stepped to their places at his right and left, and drew back the long folds of the mantle. As the acolyte stooped to lift his robe from the chancel floor, the lay fraternities heading the procession started to pace down the nave in stately double file, with lighted candles held to left and right. He stood above them by the altar, motionless under the white canopy, holding the Eucharist aloft with steady hands, and watched them as they passed, 2 by 2, with candles and banners and torches, with crosses and images and flags. They swept slowly down the chancel steps, along the broad nave between the garlanded pillars, and out under the lifted scarlet curtains into the blazing sunlight of the street, and the sound of their chanting died into a rolling murmur, drowned in the pealing of new and newer voices as the unending stream flowed on, and yet new footsteps echoed down the nave. The companies of the parishes passed, with their white shrouds and veiled faces. Then the brothers of the Misericordia, black from head to foot, their eyes faintly gleaming through the holes in their masks. Next came the monks in solemn row, the mendicant friars with their dusky cowls and bare brown feet, the white-robed, grave Dominicans. Then followed the lay officials of the district, dragoons and carabineers, and the local police officials, the governor in gala uniform, with his brother officers beside him. A deacon followed, holding up a great cross between two acolytes with gleaming candles, and as the curtains were lifted high to let them pass out at the doorway, Montanelli caught a momentary glimpse, from where he stood under the canopy, of the sunlit blaze of carpeted street and flag-hung walls, and white-robed children scattering roses. Ah, the roses, how red they were! On and on the procession paced in order, form succeeding to form, and color to color. Long white surplices, grave and seemly, gave way to gorgeous vestments and embroidered pluvials. Now passed a tall and slender golden cross, borne high above the lighted candles. Now the cathedral canons stately in their dead white mantles. A chaplain paced down the chancel, with the crozier between two flaring torches. Then the acolytes moved forward in step, their censers swinging to the rhythm of the music. The bearers raised the canopy higher, counting their steps, 1, 2, 1, 2, and Montanelli started upon the way of the cross. Down the chancel steps and all along the nave he passed, under the gallery where the organ pealed and thundered, under the lifted curtains that were so red, so fearfully red, and out into the glaring street, where the blood-red roses lay and withered, crushed into the red carpet by the passing of many feet. A moment's pause at the door, while the lay officials came forward to replace the canopy bearers. Then the procession moved on again, and he with it, his hands clasping the Eucharistic sun, and the voices of the choristers swelling and dying around him, with the rhythmical swaying of censers and the rolling tramp of feet. Verbum caro, panem verum, verbo carnem efficit, sitque sanguis Christi merum. Always blood, and always blood. The carpet stretched before him like a red river. The roses lay like blood splashed on the stones. O God, is all thine earth grown red, and all thy heaven? Ah, what is it to thee? Thou mighty God, thou whose very lips are smeared with blood. Tantum ergo sacramentum, veneremur cernui. He looked through the crystal shield at the Eucharist. What was that oozing from the wafer, dripping down between the points of the golden sun, down onto his white robe? What had he seen dripping down, dripping from a lifted hand? The grass in the courtyard was trampled and red, all red. There was so much blood. It was trickling down the cheek, and dripping from the pierced right hand, and gushing in a hot red torrent from the wounded side. Even a lock of the hair was dabbled in it, the hair that lay all wet and matted on the forehead. Ah, that was the death sweat. It came from the horrible pain. The voices of the choristers rose higher, triumphantly. Genitori, genitoque, las et jubilatio, salus, honor, virtus, coque, sit et benedictio. Oh, that is more than any patience can endure. God, who sittest on the brazen heavens enthroned, and smilest with bloody lips, looking down upon agony and death, is it not enough? Is it not enough, without this mockery of praise and blessing? Body of Christ, thou that was broken for the salvation of men. Blood of Christ, thou that was shed for the remission of sins. Is it not enough? Ah, call him louder, perchance he sleepeth. Dost thou sleep indeed, dear love, and wilt thou never wake again? Is the grave so jealous of its victory, and will the black pit under the tree not loose thee even for a little heart's delight? Then the thing behind the crystal shield made answer, and the blood dripped down as it spoke. Hast thou chosen, and wilt thou repent of thy choice? Is thy desire not fulfilled? Look upon these men that walk in the light, and are clad in silk and in gold. For their sake was I laid in the black pit. Look upon the children scattering roses, and hearken to their singing, if it be sweet. For their sake is my mouth filled with dust, and the roses are red from the well springs of my heart. See where the people kneel to drink the blood that drips from thy garment hem. For their sake was it shed, to quench their ravening thirst. For it is written, Greater love hath no man than this, if a man lay down his life for his friends. Oh, Arthur, Arthur, there is greater love than this. If a man lay down the life of his best beloved, is not that greater? And it answered again, Who is thy best beloved? In sooth, not I. And when he would have spoken, the words froze on his tongue, for the singing of the choristers passed over them as the north wind over icy pools, and hushed them into silence. Dedit fragilibus corporis ferculum, dedit et tristibus sanguinis poculum, decens accipite quod trado vasculum, omnes ex eo bibiti. Drink of it, Christians, drink of it, all of you. Is it not yours? For you the red stream stains the grass. For you the living flesh is seared and torn. Eat of it, cannibals. Eat of it, all of you. This is your feast and your orgy. This is the day of your joy. Haste you and come to the festival. Join the procession and march with us, women and children, young men and old men, coming to the sharing of flesh. Come to the pouring of blood wine, and drink of it while it is red. Take and eat of the body. Ah, God! The fortress, sullen and brown, with crumbling battlements and towers dark among the barren hills, it scowled on the procession sweeping past in the dusty road below. The iron teeth of the portcullis were drawn down over the mouth of the gate, and as a beast crouched on the mountainside, the fortress guarded its prey. Yet be the teeth clenched never so fast, they shall be broken and riven asunder, and the grave in the courtyard within shall yield up her dead. For the Christian hosts are marching, marching in mighty procession to their sacramental feast of blood, as marches an army of famished rats to the gleaning. And their cry is, Give, give, and they say not, It is enough. Wilt thou not be satisfied? For these men was I sacrificed. Thou hast destroyed me, that they might live. And behold, they march every one on his ways, and they shall not break their ranks. This is the army of Christians, the followers of thy God, a great people and a strong. A fire devoureth before them, and behind them a flame burneth. The land is as the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Yea, and nothing shall escape them. Oh, yet come back to me, beloved, for I repent me of my choice. Come back, and we will creep away together to some dark and silent grave, where the devouring army shall not find us, and we will lay us down there, locked in one another's arms, and sleep, and sleep, and sleep. And the hungry Christians shall pass by in the merciless daylight above our heads, and when they howl for blood to drink and for flesh to eat, their cry shall be faint in our ears. And they shall pass on their ways, and leave us to our rest. And it answered yet again, Where shall I hide me? Is it not written, They shall run to and fro in the city, they shall run upon the wall, they shall climb up upon the houses, they shall enter in at the windows like a thief? If I build me a tomb on the mountain top, shall they not break it open? If I dig me a grave in the river bed, shall they not tear it up? Verily, they are keen as bloodhounds to seek out their prey, and for them are my wounds red, that they may drink. Canst thou not hear them, what they sing? And they sang as they went in between the scarlet curtains of the cathedral door, for the procession was over, and all the roses were strewn. Ave verum corpus natum de Maria Virgine, vera passum immolatum in cruce pro homine, cujus latus perforatum, undum fluxit cum sanguine, esto nobis pregustatum, mortis in examine. And when they had left off singing, he entered at the doorway, and passed between the silent rows of monks and priests, where they knelt, each man in his place, with the lighted candles uplifted. And he saw their hungry eyes fixed on the sacred body that he bore, and he knew why they bowed their heads as he passed. For the dark stream ran down the folds of his white vestments, and on the stones of the cathedral floor his footsteps left a deep red stain. So he passed up the nave to the chancel rails, and there the bearers paused, and he went out from under the canopy and up to the altar steps. To left and right the white-robed acolytes knelt with their censers, and the chaplains with their torches, and their eyes shone greedily in the flaring light as they watched the body of the victim. And as he stood before the altar, holding aloft with blood-stained hands the torn and mangled body of his murdered love, the voices of the guests bidden to the Eucharistic feast rang out in another peal of song. O salutaris hostia, quae coeli pandis ostium, bella praemunt hostilia, de robur fer auxilium. Ah, and now they come to take the body. Go then, dear heart, to thy bitter doom, and open the gates of heaven for these ravening wolves that will not be denied. The gates that are opened for me are the gates of the nethermost hell. And as the deacon of honor placed the sacred vessel on the altar, Montanelli sank down where he had stood, and knelt upon the step, and from the white altar above him the blood flowed down and dripped upon his head, and the voices of the singers rang on, pealing under the arches and echoing along the vaulted roof. Uni trinoque Domini, sit sempiterna gloria, qui vitam sine termino, nobis donet in patria, sine termino, sine termino. O happy Jesus, who could sink beneath his cross? O happy Jesus, who could say, "It is finished"? This doom is never ended. It is eternal as the stars in their courses. This is the worm that dieth not, and the fire that is not quenched. Sine termino, sine termino. Wearily, patiently, he went through his part in the remaining ceremonies, fulfilling mechanically, from old habit, the rites that had no longer any meaning for him. Then, after the benediction, he knelt down again before the altar and covered his face, and the voice of the priest reading aloud the list of indulgences swelled and sank like a far-off murmur from a world to which he belonged no more. The voice broke off, and he stood up and stretched out his hand for silence. Some of the congregation were moving towards the doors. They turned back with a hurried rustle and murmur as a whisper went through the cathedral. His Eminence is going to speak. His ministers, startled and wondering, drew closer to him, and one of them whispered hastily, "Your Eminence, do you intend to speak to the people now?" Montanelli silently waved him aside. The priests drew back, whispering together. The thing was unusual, even irregular, but it was within the cardinal's prerogative if he chose to do it. No doubt he had some statement of exceptional importance to make, some new reform from Rome to announce, or a special communication from the Holy Father. Montanelli looked down from the altar steps upon the sea of upturned faces. Full of eager expectancy, they looked up to him as he stood above them, spectral and still and white. "Shh, shh, silence!" the leaders of the procession called softly, and the murmuring of the congregation died into stillness, as a gust of wind dies among whispering treetops. All the crowd gazed up in breathless silence at the white figure on the altar steps. Slowly and steadily he began to speak. "It is written in the Gospel according to St. John, 'God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that the world through him might be saved.' This is the festival of the body and blood of the victim who was slain for your salvation, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sins of the world. The Son of God, who died for your transgressions. And you are assembled here in solemn festival array to eat of the sacrifice that was given for you, and to render thanks for this great mercy. And I know that this morning, when you came to share in the banquet, to eat of the body of the victim, your hearts were filled with joy, as you remembered the passion of God the Son, who died that you might be saved. But tell me, which among you has thought of that other passion, of the passion of God the Father, who gave his Son to be crucified? Which of you has remembered the agony of God the Father when he bent from his throne in the heavens above and looked down upon Calvary? I have watched you today, my people, as you walked in your ranks in solemn procession, and I have seen that your hearts are glad within you for the remission of your sins, and that you rejoice in your salvation. Yet I pray you that you consider at what price that salvation was bought. Surely it is very precious, and the price of it above rubies. It is the price of blood. A faint, long shudder passed through the listening crowd. In the chancel, the priests bent forward and whispered to one another, but the preacher went on speaking, and they held their peace. Therefore it is that I speak with you this day. I am that I am. For I looked upon your weakness and your sorrow, and upon the little children about your feet, and my heart was moved to compassion for their sake, that they must die. Then I looked into my dear Son's eyes, and I knew that the atonement of blood was there, and I went my way and left him to his doom. This is the remission of sins. He died for you, and the darkness has swallowed him up. He is dead, and there is no resurrection. He is dead, and I have no son. Oh, my boy, my boy! The cardinal's voice broke into a long, wailing cry, and the voices of the terrified people answered it like an echo. All the clergy had risen from their places, and the deacons of honor started forward to lay their hands on the preacher's arm. But he wrenched it away, and faced them suddenly with the eyes of an angry wild beast. "What is this? Is there not blood enough? Wait your turn, jackals. You shall all be fed." They shrank away and huddled shivering together, their panting breath thick and loud, their faces white with the whiteness of chalk. Montanelli turned again to the people, and they swayed and shook before him as a field of corn before a hurricane. "You have killed him. You have killed him, and I suffered it, because I would not let you die. And now when you come about me with your lying praises and your unclean prayers, I repent me that I have done this thing. It were better that you all should rot in your vices, in the bottomless filth of damnation, and that he should live. What is the worth of your plague-spotted souls, that such a price should be paid for them? But it is too late, too late. I cry aloud, but he does not hear me. I beat at the door of the grave, but he will not wake. I stand alone in desert space and look around me, from the blood-stained earth where the heart of my heart lies buried, to the void and awful heaven that is left unto me, desolate. I have given him up. O generation of vipers, I have given him up for you. Take your salvation, since it is yours. I fling it to you, as a bone is flung to a pack of snarling curs. The price of your banquet is paid for you. Come, then, and gorge yourselves, cannibals, bloodsuckers, carrion beasts that feed on the dead. See where the blood streams down from the altar, foaming and hot from my darling's heart, the blood that was shed for you. Wallow and lap it, and smear yourselves red with it. Snatch and fight for the flesh and devour it, and trouble me no more. This is the body that was given for you. Look at it, torn and bleeding, throbbing still with the tortured life, quivering from the bitter death agony. Take it, Christians, and eat. He had caught up the sun with the host and lifted it above his head, and now flung it crashing down upon the floor. At the ring of the metal on stone, the clergy rushed forward together, and 20 hands seized the madman. Then, and only then, the silence of the people broke in a wild, hysterical scream, and overturning chairs and benches, beating at the doorways, trampling one upon another, tearing down curtains and garlands in their haste, the surging, sobbing human flood poured out upon the street. End of chapter 8 of the third part. Epilogue of The Gadfly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Gadfly by Ethel Lilian VOYNICH. Epilogue. Gemma, there's a man downstairs who wants to see you. Martini spoke in the subdued tone which they had both unconsciously adopted during these last 10 days. That, and a certain slow evenness of speech and movement, were the sole expression which either of them gave to their grief. Emma, with bare arms and an apron over her dress, was standing at a table, putting up little packages of cartridges for distribution. She had stood over the work since early morning, and now in the glaring afternoon her face looked haggard with fatigue. "A man, Caesar? What does he want?" "I don't know, dear. He wouldn't tell me. He said he must speak to you alone." "Very well." She took off her apron and pulled down the sleeves of her dress. "I must go to him, I suppose, but it's very likely it's only a spy. In any case, I shall be in the next room within call. As soon as you get rid of him, you had better go and lie down a bit. You have been standing too long today." "Oh, no, I would rather go on working." She went slowly down the stairs, Martini following in silence. She had grown to look 10 years older in these few days, and the gray streak across her hair had widened into a broad band. She mostly kept her eyes lowered now, but when, by chance, she raised them, he shivered at the horror in their shadows. In the little parlor, she found a clumsy-looking man standing with his heels together in the middle of the floor. His whole figure and the half-frightened way he looked up when she came in suggested to her that he must be one of the Swiss guards. He wore a countryman's blouse, which evidently did not belong to him, and kept glancing round as though afraid of detection. "Can you speak German?" he asked in the heavy Zurich patois. "A little. I hear you want to see me." "You are Signora Bolla? I've brought you a letter." "A letter?" She was beginning to tremble, and rested one hand on the table to steady herself. "I am one of the guard over there." He pointed out of the window to the fortress on the hill. "It's from the man that was shot last week. He wrote it the night before. I promised him I'd give it into your own hand myself." She bent her head down. So he had written after all. "That's why I've been so long bringing it," the soldier went on. "He said I was not to give it to anyone but you, and I couldn't get off before. They watched me so. I had to borrow these things to come in." He was fumbling in the breast of his blouse. The weather was hot, and the sheet of folded paper that he pulled out was not only dirty and crumpled, but damp. He stood for a moment shuffling his feet uneasily, then put up one hand and scratched the back of his head. "You won't say anything," he began again timidly, with a distrustful glance at her. "It's as much as my life's worth to have come here." "Of course I shall not say anything. No, wait a minute." As he turned to go, she stopped him, feeling for her purse, but he drew back, offended. "I don't want your money," he said roughly. "I did it for him, because he asked me to. I'd have done more than that for him. He'd been good to me. God help me." The little catch in his voice made her look up. He was slowly rubbing a grimy sleeve across his eyes. "We had to shoot," he went on under his breath, "my mates and I. A man must obey orders. We bungled it, and had to fire again. And he laughed at us. He called us the awkward squad, and he'd been good to me." There was silence in the room. A moment later he straightened himself up, made a clumsy military salute, and went away. She stood still for a little while with the paper in her hand, then sat down by the open window to read. The letter was closely written in pencil, and in some parts hardly legible. But the first 2 words stood out quite clear upon the page, and they were in English. "Dear Jem." The writing grew suddenly blurred and misty, and she had lost him again. Had lost him again! At the sight of the familiar childish nickname, all the hopelessness of her bereavement came over her afresh, and she put out her hands in blind desperation, as though the weight of the earth clods that lay above him were pressing on her heart. Presently she took up the paper again and went on reading. "I am to be shot at sunrise tomorrow, so if I am to keep at all my promise to tell you everything, I must keep it now. But after all, there is not much need of explanations between you and me. We always understood each other without many words, even when we were little things. And so, you see, my dear, you had no need to break your heart over that old story of the blow. It was a hard hit, of course, but I have had plenty of others as hard, and yet I have managed to get over them, even to pay back a few of them. And here I am still, like the mackerel in our nursery book, I forgot its name, alive and kicking, oh! This is my last kick, though, and then tomorrow morning, and Benita la Commedia. You and I will translate that. The variety show is over, and we'll give thanks to the gods that they have had, at least, so much mercy on us. It is not much, but it is something, and for this and all other blessings may we be truly thankful. About that same time tomorrow morning, I want both you and Martini to understand clearly that I am quite happy and satisfied, and could ask no better thing of fate. Tell that to Martini as a message from me. He is a good fellow and a good comrade, and he will understand. You see, dear, I know that the stick-in-the-mud people are doing us a good turn, and themselves a bad one, by going back to secret trials and executions so soon. And I know that if you, who are left, stand together steadily and hit hard, you will see great things. As for me, I shall go out into the courtyard with as light a heart as any child starting home for the holidays. I have done my share of the work, and this death sentence is the proof that I have done it thoroughly. They kill me because they are afraid of me, and what more can any man's heart desire? It desires just one thing more, though. A man who is going to die has a right to a personal fancy, and mine is that you should see why I have always been such a sulky brute to you, and so slow to forget old scores. Of course, though, you understand why, and I tell you only for the pleasure of writing the words. I loved you, Gemma, when you were an ugly little girl in a gingham frock, with a scratchy tucker, and your hair in a pigtail down your back. And I love you still. Do you remember that day when I kissed your hand, and when you so piteously begged me never to do that again? It was a scoundrelly trick to play, I know, but you must forgive that. And now I kiss the paper where I have written your name, so I have kissed you twice, and both times without your consent. That is all. Goodbye, my dear. There was no signature, but a verse which they had learned together as children was written under the letter. Then am I a happy fly, if I live or if I die. Half an hour later, Martini entered the room, and, startled out of the silence of half a lifetime, threw down the placard he was carrying and flung his arms about her. Gemma, what is it, for God's sake? Don't sob like that. You that never cry. Gemma! Gemma, my darling. Nothing, Cesar. I will tell you afterwards. I can't talk about it just now. She hurriedly slipped the tear-stained letter into her pocket, and, rising, leaned out of the window to hide her face. Martini held his tongue and bit his mustache. After all these years he had betrayed himself like a schoolboy, and she had not even noticed it. "The cathedral bell is tolling," she said, after a little while, looking round with recovered self-command. "Someone must be dead." "That is what I came to show you," Martini answered in his everyday voice. He picked up the placard from the floor and handed it to her. Hastily printed in large type was a black-bordered announcement that "Our dearly beloved bishop, His Eminence the Cardinal, Monsignor Lorenzo Montanelli, had died suddenly at Ravenna from the rupture of an aneurism of the heart." She glanced up quickly from the paper, and Martini answered the unspoken suggestion in her eyes with a shrug of his shoulders. "What would you have, Madonna? Aneurism is as good a word as any other." End of Epilogue. End of The Gadfly by Ethel Lilian VOYNICH.